This guy Kojinshin leads the legendary 3,000 black armored ghost cavalry fearlessly against 100,000 Tong soldiers, without a single hint of hesitation. The enemy general, growing arrogant because of his overwhelming numbers, decides to charge forward, but the moment they meet, he is sent to meet his maker in a single strike. The Tong soldiers are left stunned beyond disbelief. Without wasting a second, Kojinshin orders his men to charge and slaughter every enemy in sight. Despite the Tong army's massive numerical advantage, they are being destroyed rapidly, and the black armored ghost cavalry successfully rescues the civilians. Witnessing this scene, even the enemy cannot help but wonder, how is this even possible? But the victory is not yet secure. Kojinshin knows this clearly when he sees another wave of enemies rushing toward them. To ensure that every civilian escapes alive, he decides that he will personally charge forward and clear an escape path. With swift maneuvering, he rushes ahead, cutting down enemies left and right while guiding the civilians behind him towards safety. Soon they break through. However, when he looks back, he can still see his men fiercely fighting to protect the flank. Just as he prepares to return, one of the civilians steps forward and volunteers to join the fight, leaving his son behind. And so they turn back to face the 100,000-strong Tong army once more. No matter how many enemies stand before them, Kojinshin continues to command his men fearlessly to fight until the very end. Meanwhile, the civilians pound the city gate desperately, begging to be let inside. From atop the walls, the soldiers look down, but they force themselves to ignore the pleading eyes below. Inside, King Bajing grips the armrest of his throne so tightly it creaks. He looks furious. He demands to know from his guard captain if there truly is no other way. The captain falls to his knees and begs to be executed for his failure. The enemy's numbers are simply too overwhelming. King Bajing lets out a bitter laugh, which slowly breaks into tears. The captain urges him to escape before the encirclement tightens, but the king, crushed with shame, says he has failed his lineage. Even if he flees, where could he possibly go? The captain reveals they've prepared a ship. He must sail south, gather what remains of their forces, and rebuild. The king sighs, even if they gather men who will fight. The captain reminds him of one name, the great Disaja Kojinshin. At that, King Bajing's eyes spark with hope. He realizes the captain is right. Then he makes one final request. We don't hear what he says, but the meaning becomes clear when one of his wives steps forward, carrying their child. Some time later, we return to the battlefield. The boy's father lies dead on the ground. General Kojinshin stands over him, solemnly stating that his death will be remembered by his son. Another wave of Tang soldiers crest the hill. Buru and Yuru immediately start trash-talking each other, betting on who can kill more enemies. Huey chimes in, saying the tide of battle has already turned. Kojinshin narrows his eyes and admits that pushing forward from here won't be easy. Buru and Yuru suggest turning it into a contest. Whoever kills the least will have to pluck the beard of the great King Yama. Kojinshin pauses, then smirks. A contest, ho, he says. It doesn't sound bad. In fact, it sounds fun. Everybody bursts into laughter, and the sound rolls across the battlefield like thunder. Huey smiles softly. The tension that had been weighing on them lifts just a little. But deep down, every single one of them has already accepted it. This will be the place they die. Huey glances at Kojinshin and says that if this is their final battlefield, then at least it should be thrilling. Kojinshin slowly raises his spear into the air. In an instant, the men lock in. His voice cuts through the wind as he declares that not a single enemy shall set foot inside Pyongyang Fortress. But back at the city gates, the massive doors begin to creak open. The captain of the guard steps out. Kojinshin turns toward him, and the captain announces that this is a direct command from His Majesty, for Kojinshin and every man here to retreat immediately. They hesitate, but orders are orders. They begin pulling back, abandoning the fortress. Buru and Yuru exchange glances, wondering what will become of the fortress if they leave it undefended. But they reason that the emperor must have a plan. All the guard captain tells them is this: they are to move to the port, board the ships, and await further orders. Huey pieces it together first. It seems the emperor intends to sail south and regroup what remains of their forces as they march. Something catches Kojinshin's eye. A noble's carriage lies abandoned on the ground. Yuru scoffs, saying the man must have ruined the country and tried to flee. Pathetic. He mutters that he wishes he could have put a hole in that coward's skull himself. Suddenly, a frantic soldier rushes toward Kojinshin and reports a problem. A Tang cavalry unit, 500 strong, is pursuing them from the direction of the fortress. It appears they're chasing a carriage that left earlier. Huey assumes it's just another fleeing noble, but the soldier shakes his head. The carriage bears the emperor's flag. Up ahead, the guard captain and his men form a tight perimeter around it, shouting for everyone to stay close. No one is to break through. The Tang cavalry closes the distance fast. One of the rear guards volunteers to buy them time. The captain calls it nonsense, but the man has already made up his mind. He calls for 10 others to follow him and shouts for the vice captain to come along. The vice captain ignores him. Instead, he smiles. He says his duty is to protect His Highness, the Crown Prince. Then he spurs his horse forward and charges straight into the Tang cavalry. The clash is instant. The enemy commander drives a spear clean through his throat. The vice captain grits his teeth, but it's too much. He's thrown from his horse and impaled into the ground. His men are cut down just as quickly. The Tang resume their pursuit of the carriage. The guard captain looks back, witnessing the vice captain's fall, and when he turns forward again, an arrow whistles past his face. It isn't meant for him. It flies over his shoulder and pierces the Tang cavalry leader behind him, knocking him clean off his horse. The guard captain looks ahead and sees it. Ko Jinshin's banner. Tears stream down his face as Ko Jinshin and his men charge straight toward them, sweeping past to intercept the Tang forces, and buy time for the carriage to escape toward the port. As the two leaders pass each other, they exchange brief greetings. Nothing more. They both know their duties. Ko Jinshin must buy time. The guard captain must escort the crown prince. Ko Jinshin roars an order, annihilate every enemy in front of them. His men scream and crash into the Tang forces, and the battlefield turns into a bloodbath. Two Tang soldiers leap at Huey, but a single arrow punches through both of their skulls. It's Yuru, he grins, saying that puts him up by 2. Yuru tightens his grip on his axe and cleaves straight through a man and his horse in one brutal swing, shouting that he only needs one more to catch up. In the middle of the chaos, Ko Jinshin rides up beside the guard captain and asks if the emperor is inside the carriage. The answer is no. Then who is? The guard captain tells him it's the crown prince. He bows his head before Ko Jinshin. The general is taken aback. He hadn't even known, but if the crown prince is here and the emperor is not, then there's only one conclusion: the emperor must be dead. After driving off the pursuing cavalry, Ko Jinshin regroups with the main force. Together they continue toward the port. As they ride, Ko Jinshin recalls, asking the guard captain whether this truly was a decree from His Majesty. The answer had been yes. His Majesty ordered them to escort the young emperor by ship to a safe location. Still, doubt lingers in Ko Jinshin's mind. If it truly was the emperor's order, then it confirms he's gone. Night stretches on, slowly giving way to dawn. They still have some distance left to cover, but Huey estimates they'll reach the port by sunrise. Suddenly, a scout calls out the enemy is here. From the hilltop, they see Tang forces moving below. Yuru and Buru immediately begin hyping the men up, their voices sharp and eager. Ko Jinshin gives the command to move. The cavalry will follow him, the rest will stay behind and protect the young emperor. The forces split. Ko Jinshin and his riders descend the mountain. To meet the Tang head-on, they line up in formation, and Ko Jinshin orders Yuru to fire at once. As the enemy draws closer, Yuru pulls back his bowstring. His unit mirrors him. He calls out that they are aiming for 2 kills per arrow. Yuru releases the first shot, and then a storm of arrows fills the sky, blocking out the light like a scene straight out of 300. The Tang soldiers begin dropping one after another. Ko Jinshin sees the opening and takes it. While the Tang forces are still disoriented from the arrow barrage, he charges straight in, cutting into their formation and disrupting their flow. At the last second, he pivots sharply to the side, and his men follow in perfect sync. Slicing through the enemy ranks, Ko Jinshin decapitates a Tang soldier in one clean motion. But from a nearby plateau, Tang general watches calmly, waiting for the moment they grow tired. Meanwhile, inside the carriage, the young crown prince is being gently lulled to sleep, when suddenly an arrow rips through the roof, nearly striking them. The woman inside screams in panic, and the young emperor bursts into tears. Now that the Tang forces have reached the coastline as well, shield bearers are ordered to the front to block incoming arrows. They move quickly, locking their shields together just as another volley rains down. The arrows thud against the wall of shields, but the formation holds firm. Then the Tang infantry charge in on foot. The spearmen brace for impact. One of the commanders shouts that they will hold the enemy back until the young emperor safely boards the ship. They must endure until the great envoy arrives, Jai Eungsam shouted. The Tang forces draw closer, but before they can fully surround them, Ko Jinshin crashes back into the battlefield. At last, the main Tang commander steps forward and introduces himself as Wei Zhongxian, guard general of the Tang Empire. Ko Jinshin stares him down. Wei Zhongxian smirks and offers him a deal if he surrenders now. He'll personally request that His Imperial Majesty grant Ko Jinshin the honor of serving under the Tang Empire. He even says he'll make him his right-hand man. Ko Jinshin slowly nods. Wei Zhongxian bursts into laughter, calling it a wise choice. And then an arrow pierces straight through his skull. That nod, it was the signal. Yuru's arrow doesn't just kill Wei Zhongxian, it continues through and pierces the man standing behind him. The Tang general drops lifeless to the ground. Yuru and Buru immediately start trash-talking, asking the Tang soldiers if they only know how to fight with their mouths. The Tang scramble to protect their fallen commander, but Ko Jinshin doesn't give them time. He orders Huey to move. Huey grabs his axe and shouts for all troops to follow his call and charge. They hurl their axes forward, tearing through the front line. One Tang soldier, lying on the ground with an axe buried in his chest, looks up just in time to see a horse's hoof come crashing down on his skull, popping it like a watermelon. The slaughter continues. Back at the port, Jai Eungsam and his forces have managed to hold their ground as well. He's completely gassed, barely catching his breath. When he hears the thunder of approaching horses, for a split second he wonders, is it friend or foe? Then he spots Ko Jinshin's banner. Relief washes over him. He shouts to his men that the great envoy has arrived. Cheers erupt, but Ko Jinshin doesn't waste time celebrating. He yells that the Tang troops are right behind them. They need to board the ships immediately, move like their feet are on fire. By the time the Tang forces reach the beach, it's already too late. The fleet has set sail. They push out into open waters, crossing the ocean, as the coastline fades behind them. For the first time, Ko Jinshin finally meets the crown prince face to face. He looks down at the child, and asks his name. The guard captain answers His Majesty named him Yulji. Ko Jinshin then asks what His Majesty's next command was. The guard captain falls silent. A heavy silence. Ko Jinshin asks where His Majesty is. He captain slowly reaches into his armor and pulls out a sealed note. It was meant to be delivered. Ko Jinshin already understands. He hands Yulji back before opening it. The letter reveals the truth. The emperor gives his final command, not as a king but as an elder brother. He asks Ko Jinshin to take the child and the remaining survivors far, far away and live peacefully. He says he's exhausted from the war. This is his last request to his little brother. Ko Jinshin's expression hardens. A man he could never bring himself to call brother now dares to call himself one, and tells him to flee. He demands to know what happened to Pyongyang Fortress. The guard captain remains silent again. Ko Jinshin shouts for him to speak. Instead, the captain drops to his knees, begging to be executed. That's all the answer Ko Jinshin needs. The realization hits him. Just like his brother, the last of Goguryeo royal lineage. They have failed their ancestors. For 900 years, their forefathers held this land, and he couldn't protect it. Suddenly, the sea grows violent. The waters churn unnaturally, throwing everyone off balance. Ko Jinshin stumbles into the railing. As the crown prince begins crying loudly, the waves grow worse by the second. There's even a strange red tint in the water. Then a storm rolls in. Massive waves slam against the ships, tossing them like toys. The men cling to anything they can grab, tying ropes around their waists to avoid being swept overboard. Some ships begin capsizing in the distance. The ship captain rushes to Ko Jinshin and shouts that they need to turn back. He spent his entire life at sea, but he's never seen waves like these. Ahead of them is a massive wall of water. If they continue forward, they'll all die. Ko Jinshin stares into the storm. The captain begs him again, turn the ship around. But Ko Jinshin glances at his nephew's faint smile. At this point, there's no path left to return to. Lightning crashes down nearby. Ko Jinshin roars for his men to push through the waves. This is His Majesty's will, and thus begins the battle of the Goguryeo navy. Ko Jinshin raises his blade and points it straight at the towering wall of water ahead of them. He tells his men to break through it because they have no other choice, and then they do the unthinkable. They charge toward the wave. The ships surge forward as water spouts twist into existence all around them, spiraling violently across the sea. The fleet crashes straight into the massive wall, the men shouting as if they're battling a living enemy. The ships are swallowed, dragged upward and inward, sucked into the heart of the raging wave. Then a bright blue light erupts from within the storm. It expands rapidly, swallowing everything in its glow, until the world turns completely white. Ko Jinshin slowly opens his eyes. His first thought isn't about the storm, it's about his nephew. Panting, he pushes himself upright, body aching, and then he hears it. He looks over and sees his nephew alive, giggling and waving his tiny hands. Confusion clouds his face. One of the men nearby mutters that this makes no sense. The mainland should still be far away. Buru looks around and says the typhoon is gone. Just like that, it grew quiet all of a sudden. He says it's a relief, and if they can see land, they should dock quickly. Then he squints at the ship captain and asks why he's standing there like that. Does he have an arrow stuck in his head or something? The man points outward, saying it's just strange. Buru nods. The land is massive, the view's incredible. But no matter where he looks, there's land everywhere, even behind them. He pauses. Wait, when did the sea get this narrow? They're not in the open ocean anymore, maybe they're in a lake. Ko Jinshin asks how that's even possible. Yuru grabs the ship captain by the collar, practically choking him, demanding to know if they somehow sailed in circles inside a lake for days. Huey tells him to calm down, but Yuru's furious, asking how he can be so calm when the captain clearly has no idea what he's doing. Instead of arguing, Huey turns to Ko Jinshin and asks what they should do. Ko Jinshin steadies himself. This is clearly a lake. They departed from the open sea. Whatever happened during that storm, they must now be far from where they started, which means this place is safe, at least for now. Huey nods and orders the captain to have the fleet dock. The captain shouted across the ship's order everyone to prepare for landing. As they begin moving towards shore, Ko Jinshin can only wonder where in the world they've ended up. They dock and quickly and begin setting up camp. Ko Jinshin orders Buru and Yuru to lead the soldiers and scout the surrounding area. They need to prepare for possible ambushes and establish battle lines around their location. Ko Jinshin then tells the captain and the royal guards to report their current numbers. Huey acknowledges the order. Everyone disperses to their assigned tasks. Ko Jinshin oversees the preparations, making sure everything is done properly, until he hears his nephew crying inside the tent. He steps in and is immediately greeted with, "Your Majesty." He tells them not to call him that. They quickly apologize. One of the women says she'll step outside for a moment. Ko Jinshin asks what's wrong. She awkwardly says she needs to relieve herself. He nods, then walks closer to the child. He looks down and calmly tells them to change the baby's diaper. For some reason, the women exchange uneasy glances. Before doing so, as the cloth is undone, Ko Jinshin's expression freezes. He immediately calls for the captain and the guards. Cut back to Buru and Yuru. They're in the woods casually arguing about dinner. Buru says they only need one wild boar to bring back. Yuru complains that he hasn't even seen a single ant, so why are they talking about boars? Buru snaps at him, saying he should show respect when speaking to his elder. Yuru fires back that he's the original. Buru insists he's definitely older. Their argument cuts short when they hear a strange snorting sound. They both go quiet. Weapons are drawn. The snorting continues. They exchange a look. Looks like tonight's pork is secured. They creep closer toward the sound, and instead of a boar they see a foot. They freeze. Buru squints and asks if pigs in this area walk on two legs. Yuru stares harder and says more importantly, "Why are these pigs blue?" Buru mutters there's no way they're just bruised all over. Yuru doesn't even know what that's supposed to mean but shrugs it off. They both start getting excited again. Two legs or not, as long as the meat tastes good, that's all that matters. Meanwhile, the orcs, because yes, that's what they are, just stare at them in confusion. Buru and Yuru's hunger overtakes all logic. They grin. The orcs finally realize they're being looked at like dinner, but it's too late. Buru and Yuru leap forward. The forest echoes with screams. Back at the camp, Ko Jinshin presses his blade lightly against one of the maidens' throats. She stares up at him in horror. The captain of the guard rushes into the tent, demanding to know what's happening. Ko Jinshin coldly states that the child has been changed. The captain immediately understands. He drops to his knees. Then he pulls out another letter. Ko Jinshin narrows his eyes and asks why there are two letters. The captain explains that this second letter was meant to be delivered only after they safely reached their destination. Ko Jinshin asks again there were truly two letters. The captain confirms it. Ko Jinshin takes the letter and begins reading. In it, his brother confesses the truth. The child Yuli is not his heir. She is the daughter of Yul Ryu Chuan, the vice commander of the royal guard who remained behind to protect him. His brother believed her life would be far too short if she stayed in a nation destined to burn. That's why he sent her away. He apologizes for the deception, saying it couldn't be helped. If Ko Jinshin had known the truth, he would have thrown his life away trying to protect the country. Though they share the same bloodline, he did not want to subject his younger brother, who had spent his entire life on the battlefield, to such cruelty. So Ko Jinshin must not blame himself for failing to protect the nation. The one who rose to the throne through rebellion must bear the karma that follows. His life in the end was lived as nothing more than a puppet of power. As one of the generals slowly approaches, the king's voice continues through the letter. He says he hopes his younger brother will live differently and carry out everything according to his will. These are his final wishes. Ko Jinshin's jaw tightens, but at the bottom of the letter there's a smaller note. It says he hopes the child grows up well and becomes his partner. What that truly means we don't know yet. Ko Jinshin exhales slowly and says that His Majesty has granted him freedom. He bows his head slightly. Now it makes sense. That's why they were calling him Your Majesty. They already knew the truth. The child was never the heir to the throne. Ko Jinshin looks down at the little girl and slowly stretches out his hand. She grabs onto his finger. He freezes for a second. Then she laughs, and just like that, his hardened heart softens. He clears his throat and turns away, telling them to finish changing her diaper. He then asks about the child's mother. The captain explains that she remained behind at the fortress, following her husband Yul Ryu Chuan to protect it until the end. He lowers his head, saying he deserves punishment for deceiving Ko Jinshin. But Ko Jinshin walks right past him. He steps outside and breathes in deeply. At 6 years old, he first held a sword. At 16, he stepped onto the battlefield. When they abandoned their homeland and fled, he fought at the very front. As a bastard born of the king's bloodline, his sole duty was to protect the empire. But now the empire is gone. The reason for his existence has vanished. He stands in an unknown land, with no idea what to draw his sword for anymore. Later that night, everyone regroups. Ko Jinshin asks about the surroundings. Buru and Yuru report that they scouted the forest. No enemies in sight. But everything feels different. The air, the trees, even the landscape, nothing looks like the world they knew. And then there's the strangest part. Blue pigs walking on two legs. Before they can continue, a soldier bursts into the meeting tent. The captain demands to know the meaning of the interruption. The soldier stammers that it seems the heavens have been angered. The captain snaps, asking what the hell that's supposed to mean. They step outside. The soldier points up at the sky. Everyone goes silent. There are 3 moons hanging above them, 2 smaller ones flanking the main moon. Huey quietly adds that even the stars look unfamiliar, like they are under an entirely different sky. Ko Jinshin nods slowly. If that's the case, at least they don't have to worry about the Tang army anymore. Huey agrees, but before he can say more, Ko Jinshin turns and walks back inside. Night passes, morning arrives, and we open on an orc absolutely losing its mind. Buru and Yuru are holding it down while it thrashes wildly. Ko Jinshin notices the commotion. The creature suddenly breaks free and tries to run. Buru and Yuru tackle it instantly, slamming it back to the ground. Ko Jinshin watches, confused. He mutters that it's strange, the pigs walk on 2 legs, maybe it's just someone wearing a pig mask. The orc desperately shouts for them to wait, that they can talk. But of course, they don't understand a word. Yuru squints and says it almost sounds like the pig is trying to speak. Buru smacks him verbally, asking what kind of animal can talk to humans. They should just hurry up and prepare it. Then Buru starts tickling it. The orc screams, begging to just be killed instead. Buru even punches it in the side. For a second it looks dead. Nope, still squealing. Ko-Jinshin finally steps in and asks what exactly they're doing. Huey answers calmly they're performing a ritual. Ko-Jinshin blinks. Fine, but why are they tickling it? Huey explains that a smiling sacrifice would be better. Ko-Jinshin sighs deeply, questioning every decision that led to this moment. He orders them to stop. They protest, saying this is the food ritual. He tells them the ritual can wait. The pig is blue, it might be diseased. Suddenly, another soldier runs in shouting that there's a problem. Buru groans and asks what it is this time. Another dog or cow walking on 2 legs. The soldier stares at him in shock. How did you know? They all stand there for a split second. Then the ground shakes. A massive minotaur smashes through their outer gate. It unleashes a deafening roar. The soldiers instinctively ready their weapons, but some of them are still stunned, asking how a cow can walk on 2 legs. The minotaur charges and swings its massive axe. It slams into their shield wall, sending the front line flying through the air. An order is shouted, throw the axes. Dozens of axes spin forward, embedding into the minotaur's body. It bleeds, but it doesn't stop. Instead, it gets angrier. It raises its axe high, but before it can bring it down, something whips through the air and wraps tightly around both of its horns. It jerks backward, missing its strike. It's Buru and Yuru. They're holding the lines, yelling that this place is insane and demanding to know what kind of world they've landed in. Yuru shouts at the soldiers that the beast isn't moving, so shoot it. The minotaur grits its teeth and starts charging, trying to drag the 2 of them along with it. Buru and Yuru grin. Is it really trying to outmuscle them? Bet. They both plant their feet and pull with everything they've got. The minotaur loses balance and crashes to the ground. Fire, they shout. Arrows rain down, riddling its body. It collapses to its knees. Buru leaps high into the air and brings his axe down in one clean, brutal strike. The minotaur's head flies off. It rolls across the ground and thuds against the shield line. Silence follows. Yuru props his axe on the corpse and laughs, saying they should be able to eat this right. Buru says only if Ko-Jinshin doesn't forbid it again. But then they hear more stomping. They turn, 3 more minotaurs emerge at the edge of camp, and behind them are werewolves. The soldiers stare in disbelief, since when do dogs walk on 2 legs? One of the minotaurs notices the severed head on the ground. Its eyes flare with rage, and it charges straight into the camp. Buru and Yuru quickly decide to split the remaining enemies half and half. Yuru asks who's taking the last one, and Buru grins, saying they'll just have to find out. The leading minotaur swings its massive weapon down, but Buru steps forward and blocks the blow head-on. His teeth grit from the impact, yet he doesn't budge an inch. Yuru backsteps at the same time and launches his own attack, while the werewolves seize the opening to flank from the sides alongside another minotaur. Seeing Buru momentarily locked in place, one of the minotaurs moves to finish him off. But in a flash of steel, blood sprays across the battlefield as its hand is severed cleanly. Ko-Jinshin stands there, blade extended. The minotaur howls in agony as crimson stains the ground. And before it can recover, Yuru drives a heavy punch into its body, forcing it to stagger backward. Dropping his stance, he swings his axe upward in a brutal arc, cleaving the creature clean in 2. At the same time, Yuru positions himself behind the chaos, bow already drawn. He dodges an incoming strike, flips through the air, and releases 2 arrows mid-motion. One pierces the chest, the other the head. The beast drops instantly, and Yuru lands in a dramatic crouch as the corpse crashes beside him. With all 3 minotaurs seemingly down, Ko-Jinshin remarks that he feels unusually light and asks Huey if he understands why. Huey calmly explains that the gravity here is weaker, making their armor, weapons, and even their bodies feel lighter than usual. Ko-Jinshin nods, saying that would explain it, and wipes the blood from his blade. The armless minotaur, however, still rages, believing it has cornered Ko-Jinshin. It slams its fist into the ground where he stood moments ago, but when it lifts its hand, there's nothing there. In the next instant, its body is carved apart into multiple pieces, and Ko-Jinshin smoothly sheaths his sword. He mutters that in this state, even the Tang would stand no chance against him, and it's almost a shame they're not here to see it. Around them, the remaining werewolves are swiftly cut down, and the survivors flee into the forest. Ko-Jinshin orders Buru to chase them down, wipe them out, and expand the scouting perimeter to learn what else inhabits this land. Deeper in the woods, a man and a woman are running. The woman's name is Sarah, and their language is completely different from Ko-Jinshin's group. The man Vaughn urges her to hurry to the village, but she refuses, shaking her head in tears. Heavy footsteps shake the ground behind them. Vaughn draws his bow and fires into the tree line as a massive ogre emerges, roaring. He shouts at it and looses an arrow, but it bounces harmlessly off the creature's thick skin. Realizing how dire the situation is, he begs Sarah again to run. She hesitates, crying, then turns to flee, but stumbles and falls. The ogre spots her and advances. Desperate, Vaughn screams and fires again, trying to draw its attention, shouting for it to eat him instead. Just as the ogre reaches for Sarah, Buru appears in a blur, scooping her up and carrying her to safety. Sarah stares at him in shock, while Buru looks puzzled, remarking that whatever that thing is, it's even bigger than the cow from before. She blurts out in confusion about what a dwarf is doing here, though the only word he can recognize is dwarf. She urgently points behind him and tells him to dodge, but he doesn't understand her language. The ogre slams its massive fist down, sending a shockwave through the forest. Yet Buru has already set her down. To safely, he flashes her a grin, then charges forward. With a swift acrobatic flip, he slices cleanly through the ogre's torso, splitting it straight down the middle. Sarah gasps and Vaughn stands frozen in disbelief. As the ogre's body separates and crashes to the ground, Buru strikes a confident pose, running a hand through his hair as if that was nothing special, and casually remarks that perhaps there's some higher order at work here. Sarah and Vaughn immediately bow in gratitude. In their language, the word for thanks sounds almost identical to Buru's name, causing him to ask how they knew it. Back at camp, Vaughn and Sarah sit inside a tent while soldiers gather around, staring curiously. Vaughn declares that no matter what happens, he'll save her. It's revealed he's actually her uncle. Sarah insists she's too injured to move and begs him to escape and warn the village instead. He refuses, saying he could never abandon her. Buru interrupts, telling him to stop rambling and speak properly so they can understand. The soldiers whisper excitedly about Sarah's hair color and complexion, wondering if they've somehow landed in the West. Ko Jinshin notices her discomfort and orders everyone to leave. The soldiers quickly scatter, restoring a bit of calm to the tent. Ko Jinshin says they must be the locals of this land. Yoru agrees immediately, but Ko Jinshin's concern isn't just who they are, it's whether they can understand them. Yoru mentions that they somehow knew his name, yet beyond that, he couldn't make sense of a single word. Ko Jinshin scans the camp, his gaze briefly landing on the captured orc, and says they still don't know where they are. More importantly, they don't know what else exists here. Besides walking pigs and cows, unknown dangers could sever their lifeline at any moment. For that reason, they need words. Of course, Sarah and Vaughn have no idea what he's saying, but Ko Jinshin calmly states that they'll eventually find a way. Huey offers to think of a solution, but Buru suddenly steps forward confidently, saying he already knows the answer. He declares that there's someone among them who's a genius capable of speaking every language under the sun. With dramatic flair, he presents none other than Jae-young-sam, who proudly introduces himself and claims he knows every language in existence. Ko Jinshin asks if that's truly the case. Jae-young-sam explains that he traveled west with his parents while growing up, picking up numerous foreign tongues along the way. Ko Jinshin tells him to prove it. Jae-young-sam straightens himself, declaring that this is his chance to show his worth. He boasts that he's been everywhere: Rome, Japan, and countless other places, and there's no land he hasn't visited, no language he doesn't know. He turns to Sarah and confidently says bonjour. She stares at him blankly. He awkwardly guesses that's not it, then he tries hello. But she doesn't react to that either. Ko Jinshin begins wondering if they're wasting their time. Not giving up, Jae-young-sam leans in for cheek-to-cheek greeting, repeating bonjour once more. Sarah panics, and Buru demands to know what he's doing. Ko Jinshin's patience wears thin, as Jae-young-sam cycles through language after language, desperately trying anything that might stick, until Yoru smacks him on the head, saying it's clearly not working. Ko Jinshin remarks that he forgot Jae-young-sam is useless outside of battle, and Buru outright calls him a con man. As Buru orders someone to drag him away, Jae-young-sam begs for another chance, still attempting to coax a response from Sarah, but it's no use. From that moment on, his new title becomes conman. After he's taken away, Huey quietly steps forward and says he'll try. He kneels on one knee, points at himself and clearly says Yon Chwigaram. Sarah looks confused at first, so he repeats it. Slowly, she attempts to say his name back, Yon Chwigaram. Realization dawns on her face, she understands. Huey then gestures toward her, asking for her name. She responds, Sarah. The camp erupts in excitement at the breakthrough. Buru bursts into loud laughter, claiming he already knew her name since she said it twice earlier. He boasts that she also knew his name when he saved her, and when she thanks him again in her language, though it still sounds like his name, he laughs proudly, saying she has a good memory. Ko Jinshin dryly comments that it just sounds like he's rambling, and Huey tells him to let Buru enjoy the moment. Finally, Ko Jinshin stands and announces that it's enough for today. Everyone goes outside, leaving Sarah and Vaughn staring after them. Vaughn mutters that he's still here too, since they completely ignored him. Later that night, at another outpost, a different scene unfolds. Inside a dimly lit room, a man sits at a table eating calmly. His name is Baron Alvin of the Barrent Kingdom, and beside him stands his guard T-Human. A tearful messenger reports that the mercenary company will soon seize the Slash-and-Burn village. Baron Alvin wipes his mouth slowly and remarks that he cannot believe those vermin are fleeing the kingdom. He vows that he will make them pay for it. Sometime later, Ko Jinshin asks if they're departing tomorrow. Huey confirms that they are. Strangely enough, Sarah has grown comfortable following Buru and Yoru around, so they decided to bring her along on the trip. Ko Jinshin remarks that purity and simplicity go hand in hand. Huey asks what he means by that, but before he can elaborate, Buru's voice is heard outside announcing his arrival. Ko Jinshin tells them to enter, and Sarah walks in alongside him, Huey immediately understands what Ko Jinshin meant and lets out a quiet laugh. Ko Jinshin explains that they'll head to the village to inform the locals that they were the ones who helped them, and that they come in peace. Yuru confidently volunteers, telling him to trust him with the task. But Ko Jinshin declines, and says he will instead send the captain of the guards. Yuru frowns, asking why he suddenly doesn't trust him. Ko Jinshin clarifies that it's not about trust. Yuru needs to focus on looking after the child and making a good impression. Since Yuru also has to organize information about the area with Vaughn, Ko Jinshin is attaching Demuduk to handle this particular detail. Yuru laughs, admitting he didn't realize Ko Jinshin was planning that far ahead. He says he thought it was a matter of distrust but now understands. Ko Jinshin stares at him and remarks that the only thing he truly trusts him with is combat, though he didn't originally plan on saying that out loud. As they prepare to head toward the village, they bring several orcs along, using them to pull the carriage. Yuru recalls Ko Jinshin saying that Royal Guard Commander Demuduk has a mountain of responsibilities back at camp, so he's sending just the two of them to go and return safely. They assure him not to worry, and head off excitedly, though Ko Jinshin clearly isn't pleased with how carefree they are. While traveling, the orcs suddenly begin sniffing the air, their movements stiffening. One of the soldiers points out that he can see the village ahead. Yuru signals everyone to halt, and calls for the so-called con man. Jai Eungsam protests that he isn't a con man, and insists he managed to learn their language in just 10 days. Yuru threatens to put him through more hellish training if he keeps arguing, and Jai Eungsam quickly backs down. Yuru tells him to simply ask whether this is the correct village. So he begins speaking with Vaughn, the two exchanging words back and forth. Vaughn warns that the villagers might be frightened by their presence, so he suggests that he and Sarah go ahead first to explain the situation. Jai Eungsam thanks him, only to be smacked on the back of the head by Buru, who demands to know why he's speaking so casually. Groaning in pain, Jai Eungsam explains that the word he used actually means thank you in their language. Yuru tells Buru to stop since he's scaring Sarah, though she doesn't seem particularly surprised. Turning to her, Yuru smiles, and she mentions that their word for thanks must sound alarming to them. She adds that when they reach the village, they'll need to warn the others not to say it. Upon arrival, Vaughn notices something is wrong. The village feels empty. Then Sarah spots several people gathered in the square. As they approach, Vaughn senses the tension and quickly pulls Sarah into hiding, telling her to stay quiet. Peering around the corner, they see the village elder confronting a man named Commander Moan. The elder demands to know what this means, reminding Moan that they were promised protection from the orc horde in exchange for food and payment. Moan crouches down to the elder's level and mocks him, saying the chief must be too old and dull to understand the situation. He coldly explains that fighting orcs is far less profitable than capturing villagers. His men grin as he orders them not to injure the women too much, not to cripple the men, and to kill anyone who has no commercial value. Chaos erupts. Villagers are beaten mercilessly. A woman begs for her child's life, and a mercenary sneers that it depends on what she's willing to do. He grabs her and drags her away while the elder screams in horror. One of the mercenaries forces the elder's head into the dirt, claiming it's better to live as a slave than to be eaten by orcs. The village chief watches helplessly as the woman is pulled around the corner of a house. He laments that they fled here to escape this kingdom's tyranny, hoping to live peacefully as farmers, and curses himself for trusting so easily. Still, he prays that Vaughn and Sarah never return. At least they might be safe. Vaughn panics and tells Sarah she must go back and inform Ko Jinshin's group about what's happening. She asks what he plans to do, and he says he'll buy as much time as he can. She tries to argue, but suddenly, she notices someone behind him. Mercenary has overheard everything, smirking that there were little mice hiding nearby. Shortly after, both Vaughn and Sarah are thrown to the ground. Vaughn has been beaten badly. The elder sees them and cries out in despair. The mercenary reports that he found them behind the barracks. Moan shrugs and tells him to handle them however he sees fit. The mercenary grabs Sarah, preparing to drag her away and violate her. Vaughn shouts at the mercenary to stop, but he's kicked hard in the face before he can do anything. The man drags Sarah away as she screams, and then suddenly his body begins to tremble. Sarah looks confused for a split second, before he falls backward, an axe buried deep in his skull. Moan demands to know what's happening, and Buru comes riding in. On horseback, the mercenaries stare confused, asking why a short-legged dwarf is here, and then notice the sheer size of his axe. He reins and sharply hops down, and asks Sarah if she's all right, telling her this place is dangerous and that she should take Vaughn and get out of here. She obeys, helping Vaughn away, while Buru shouts for everyone to brace themselves. The mercenaries don't understand what he means, until they hear more horses approaching. The cavalry storms in moments later. Buru orders his men to beat them down like beasts and kill any who are armed. The charge is overwhelming. The mercenaries are cut down with terrifying ease. One of the men who had been assaulting a woman behind a house runs out, hurriedly pulling up his pants and demanding to know what's going on. only for his head to be sent flying into the air. The slaughter continues until Moan and a few of his men manage to mount their horses. One asks if the kingdom sent a night order, but Moan dismisses the idea, saying there's no way they could have arrived so quickly. Another says he's never seen nights like these, and Moan admits he's never heard of such an order anywhere in the kingdom or even on the continent. Something about this is wrong. One of his men urges him to decide quickly before they are killed, and Moan spots what he thinks is the bolt of a crossbow in the distance. He grows anxious, insisting that arrows shouldn't be able to travel that far. If it was truly a bow, it makes no sense. He realizes they're completely outclassed. If they don't flee, they'll die. Moan orders a retreat. As they turn and ride, Buru notices and demands to know where they think they're going. Instantly giving chase, Moan shouts at a man named Jal Tong to kill them. But to Buru, that name sounds like another insult meaning shorty, and it only fuels his anger. Moan screams again. For his men to turn and fight, they try. But Buru doesn't hesitate. He tightens his grip on his axe and cuts through them in moments, killing 3 instantly. He shifts his stance atop his horse, then leaps off toward another rider. The man looks up just in time to see Buru descending before he and his horse are split clean in half, the ground beneath them shattering from the impact. Moan already knew they had made a mistake, but this is something else entirely, as Buru glares at him. Moan's heart pounds. He yells at more of his men to turn and fight, but Buru calls them even worse than regular infantry, saying he'll admit they're good at running if nothing else. Enemy horses charge toward him, but he orders his men to handle those in front. They surge past him and wipe them out in an instant. One soldier asks about the one who escaped, and Buru smirks, saying there's no need to worry because his brother Yuru is still out there. Moan nears the edge of the village, telling himself he must report this to Alvin immediately. When he hears the whistle of an arrow and feels it strike, he and his men are thrown from their horses. He staggers along the ground, clutching his wound trying to stand. In the distance, Yuru prepares his next shot. As he draws back his bow, the world seems to darken. In that darkness, he locks onto Moan. Moan whispers in terror that Buru wasn't a dwarf, he was a demon. The arrow flies. Yuru doesn't even wait to confirm the hit. He simply tells his men it's time to move, confident in his aim. Moan's brains scatter across the ground. Back in the village, survivors cling to one another, weeping. The woman who was nearly assaulted embraces her husband. Yuru comments that the most beast-like creature of all is man. The village elder falls to his knees, begging them to spare their lives. Vaughn steps forward, telling everyone to calm down and explaining that they came to help. The villagers ask if that's true, admitting they thought these were soldiers from the subjugation force, and only then realize they've truly been saved. Yuru tells Jai Eungsam to relay his words properly. Jai Eungsam agrees, but Yuru suddenly senses something and looks toward the woods, saying they'll have to finish talking later. When he focuses, he notices countless eyes staring back from the tree line. At first, he's confused, asking why there are so many pigs here now. He hopes they can hold out until reinforcements arrive. Meanwhile, one of the soldiers rides hard toward camp, remembering Buru's instruction to inform Ko Jinshin about what's happening. As he disappears down the path, more orcs begin emerging from the forest. Buru shouts for the liar Jaeyoung Sam, who asks what he needs. Buru orders him to gather every able-bodied man with a bow. As the orcs advance closer, Buru watches, while orders are passed down for everyone to draw their bows and ready themselves. Buru reprimands them, saying their woven bows won't be enough, and tells Jaeyoung Sam that when he gives the signal, he must signal the pale folks as well. He asks how many arrows remain. The men report their counts one by one. After hearing them, Buru says it will be enough and orders them to place every last arrow into their quivers. Finally, at the edge of the tree line, the orcs begin to emerge into full view. The cavalry archers are the first to draw their bows. The village elder mutters that there's no way they can possibly hit from that distance. And even Vaughn looks uncertain, admitting that while they are incredible fighters, there's no way they can defeat this many orcs. The horde begins charging. Yuru shouts that if they don't take down at least 2 with every shot, they'll all die here, and he orders his men to let them have it. In perfect unison, the arrows are released, one after another. The orcs collapse, multiple bodies dropping from single shots. The villagers stare in disbelief. They can't even see the arrows flying, yet the orcs are falling as if struck by invisible force. Some whisper that it must be magic. Without wasting a second, Yuru orders the mounted men forward, and they charge straight into the thinning ranks. At the same time, the messenger finally reaches camp. He dismounts before the horse has even fully stopped, and runs toward Ko Jinshin, shouting that a herd of at least 100 pigs, no orcs, is attacking the village. Huey's expression changes instantly, and Ko Jinshin understands there's no time to hesitate. Back at the village, one of the orcs gets dangerously close, only to be impaled clean through the skull by a spear. Buru and his men are executing precise hit-and-run tactics, exploiting the orcs' lack of intelligence. Yuru laughs, saying that in the end, pigs are still pigs. And Buru agrees, boasting that he and his twin are experts at hunting them. When one orc turns to flee, the others follow, and Buru orders the pursuit, saying they'll drive them back into the forest. Suddenly, a severed head flies through the air and rolls to a stop in front of Buru's horse. He looks up in confusion and sees a new figure stepping forward. an orc carrying a weapon in one hand and the corpse of another in the other. The orc roars that if they run from humans, they'll be eaten alive. The others call out to their chieftain, trying to explain what's happening, but he silences them. As long as he stands here, the orcs will be victorious. He declares his name Mukabal and proclaims himself a hero and strategist, the first orc to introduce military formations. The horde begins chanting his name, as he commands them to split into 4 groups and attack the village simultaneously. They obey and ignoring Buru entirely. Buru stares in disbelief that a pig is actually using tactics, and orders his men to hurry back. The orcs swarm over the walls. One leaps at a villager, who braces with his spear, and falls backward, impaling the creature through the skull. Blood sprays across his face, blinding him. As the orc hacks off his arm, he screams in agony. But then an arrow slams into the attacker's head. Yuru shouts at him to snap out of it. Seeing more orcs climbing over, Yuru realizes he's out of arrows. Without hesitation, he hurls his axe, killing one instantly. Now unarmed, he begins picking up stones and throwing them with deadly force, telling the injured man to grab his spear and keep fighting, because he won't die just from losing an arm. Reinforcements arrive to support Yuru as he orders them to push the orcs back. If they break through, everyone dies. Then he hears screams behind him. An orc is charging toward the women, but Buru returns in time, decapitating it in one clean strike. As the body falls, he tells Yuru this is spiraling out of control. Yuru replies that there's no way, they've killed at least 200 already, yet the horde seems endless. At this rate, it'll be nearly impossible to hold out until reinforcements arrive. If it were just them, they could retreat, but there are too many innocent lives at stake. The twins exchange a grin and agree it can't be helped. A man of Gog Urieo does not run from pigs. Mukabal orders his forces to surge through the breach in the wall, and the orcs pour down like a flood. Buru and Yuru brace themselves to hold the line. Just as they prepare to clash again, the ground begins to rumble violently. Yuru glances toward the horizon and sees rising dust and the silhouettes of horses. Realization hits them both. Ko Jinshin has arrived. As the cavalry charges, Buru bursts into laughter, while the orcs stand confused. He cleaves through them, declaring that the pig hunt is back on. Yuru matches his energy, as Jai Ung-sam and the others join the fray. Ko Jinshin closes in and commands a wedge formation. The orcs shout that the cavalry is here. From above, Mukabal watches, stating that he has spent his life preparing for this very day, to counter human cavalry and revolutionize orc strategy. He declares that no matter how skilled the riders are, they will never break through the wall of brave warriors. He orders them to unite. The orcs begin stacking atop one another, forming a grotesque living barrier, a monstrous wall of bodies. Buru and Yuru stare at the sight, baffled and asking what in the world they are looking at. Yuru mutters that he has no idea how he's supposed to deal with that. Mukabal proudly proclaims that the humans will be mercilessly crushed. Huey warns that charging straight into it would be disastrous. Ko Jinshin calls the formation strange, but instead of slowing down, he spurs his horse faster. At the last moment, his forces split, some veering right, others left, as the orcs continue roaring, "Unite, unite." Mukabal bursts into laughter, declaring that the human cavalry is fleeing before their very eyes. The orcs begin chanting, "Long live the orcs," convinced their formation has worked. Behind them, the villagers nervously draw their bows. Yuru scoffs, saying they couldn't possibly miss a target that large even with their eyes closed, and orders them to shoot. The arrows fly, striking the orcs from behind. The towering wall of bodies collapses in on itself as confusion spreads through their ranks. Mukabal quickly claims it is moving as expected and orders his forces to scatter. The orcs break formation and sprint in different directions. Mukabal laughs, thinking his strategy is brilliant, but Ko Jinshin watches in confusion. First, they group together to form a wall, and now they've made themselves easier targets. He orders a full-speed counterattack. The cavalry charges, cutting down the scattered orcs one after another. Mukabal again shouts for them to unite, and again they are shot down. They try fleeing, regrouping, scattering, repeating the same flawed cycle, until at last, Mukabal is pierced clean through the chest by a spear. He stares in disbelief as he topples off the cliff face first. Ko Jinshin lowers his arm, having thrown it himself, and calmly remarks that it should be quiet now. The orcs scream that their chieftain is dead, and Ko Jinshin orders his men to slaughter the rest. Some flee into the mountains, but most are cut down. The villagers release raw, primal cries, as they realize they have survived. When Ko Jinshin finally enters the village, his men greet him. The villagers look at him with uncertainty, unsure whether to kneel or flee. He surveys the carnage, the wounded, the dead, and asks for an interpreter. Yuru nudges Jai Ung-sam forward, calling him the liar again. Ko Jinshin announces that they will be leaving now, and Jai Ung-sam translates. Yuru protests, saying Ko Jinshin should listen, but Huey subtly shakes his head. The villagers panic, asking what will happen if the enemy returns. Ko Jinshin replies that they must protect their own lives. The villagers fall to their knees, begging him to protect them. Jai Ung-sam relays their plea, and Ko Jinshin asks whether they wish to become slaves. When this is translated, they look shocked. Vaughn quietly remarks that perhaps they are no different from the kingdom in the end. Ko Jinshin states firmly that his people took up the sword to protect their own nation, families, and people, not to guard those who would hand over their lives to others. The elder tries to beg again, but Ko Jinshin reminds them that this land is their nation, Surely they understand their nation must be protected by its own hands. They should never have hired mercenaries they couldn't control. That money should have been spent on swords and armor. A nation guarded by others is bound to fall. He asks them again, will they become slaves? Or will they take up the sword and risk their lives for their families? If they choose the sword, he will allow them to become his people. Hyui, Byuru, and Yuru watch him with admiration and respect. The villagers remain terrified and silent. Ko Jinshin's expression hardens with disappointment, and he tells his men they are returning to camp. Suddenly, a young boy steps forward, shouting that he will take up the sword. Ko Jinshin stops. The boy declares that even if he dies, it means Ko Jinshin will protect his family. For a brief moment, Ko Jinshin recalls the boy he once saved who wanted to fight in place of his father. He dismounts and approaches. The child trembles as Ko Jinshin tells him his grip is sloppy. He adjusts the boy's hands, teaching him how to hold the sword properly, and tells him that once he holds it, he must not think of dying, he must live to protect his family. No translation is needed to see the boy's answer in his tear-filled eyes. As the boy's courage spreads, others begin to stand. Ko Jinshin's expression softens slightly. He orders his men to bring the villagers along as they withdraw to camp. Later, birds perch above Moan's lifeless body. The sound of approaching hooves grows louder, until a rider arrives. That person was Tilluman. He surveys the corpse before entering the village with his men, observing bodies scattered everywhere. One of them reports that they searched the entire area, but no farmers remain. Alvin asks Tilluman what he believes happened. Tilluman replies that both the orcs and mercenaries were killed by the same party. Alvin scoffs, asking whether he's implying that the farmers accomplished this and fled. But Tilluman shakes his head, explaining that he found an unfamiliar arrow and believes an unknown faction has intervened. Alvin's expression darkens. He demands to know who would dare covet his property and vows that once he gathers the farmers to tribute them to the kingdom, he will eliminate whoever interfered. Back at camp, Ko Jinshin and his forces return, with the villagers trailing behind. The soldiers immediately begin whispering and staring at their different skin tones and features, commenting on how pretty one of them is. Byuru notices the drooling and snaps at them, saying that just because he was gone doesn't mean their training should slack. He tells them they'd better look forward to today's training. Demuduk looks at the refugees gathered behind Ko Jinshin and asks what their status will be. Ko Jinshin answers calmly that from this moment forward, they are people of Goguryeo as well. Demuduk hesitates and then carefully asks if that means Ko Jinshin intends to continue the Emperor's line. Ko Jinshin frowns and asks what he is implying. Demuduk begins to explain that accepting the people means, yet before he can finish, Ko Jinshin cuts him off. What they need now, he says, are soldiers to repel invaders and women and children who can become the heart that fuels the will to protect. That is why he brought them here. Demuduk still looks confused, trying to follow his reasoning. But Ko Jinshin ends the matter there. Huey then speaks up, saying that since Ko Jinshin has already accepted them as his people, he should follow the guard commander's advice and continue the Emperor's line. They do not even know where they are, or whether this is the same world they once lived in. Giving the soldiers and civilians a clear goal would become the pillar that supports their lives. It is a decision only he can make. Ko Jinshin turns toward Huey, who smiles back at him. Ko Jinshin replies that Huey would make a better emperor because he has no desire to become one. Demuduk is stunned and demands to know how he can treat this so lightly. Ko Jinshin even suggests that perhaps Byuru or Yuru could take the role. Demuduk immediately refuses, saying this is no time for jokes. After a moment of thought, Ko Jinshin tells both Huey and Demuduk that he has spent his entire life on the battlefield. He is not suited for statecraft. Demuduk can manage the civil affairs of this place as he sees fit. Demuduk attempts to persuade him again, but Ko Jinshin insists that he will do what he is capable of. Each man must shoulder the responsibility suited to him. He refuses to become emperor only to fail the nation through incompetence. The only things he knows how to do are wage war and protect. Before Demuduk can respond again, shouts erupt from the villagers about the Titan clan. They turn to see several dwarves kneeling before Byuru. Byuru looks bewildered, thinking they might belong to some ancient clan. He and Yuru joke that perhaps they cannot abandon their relatives here. But upon closer inspection, it is clear these dwarves are not like the other locals. One of the dwarves looks up in panic, and a flashback reveals that the three of them fleeing from orcs through the mountains. Gray blames himself, saying his greed to search for an ore vein led them into danger just as they are about to be overtaken. Soldiers appear and save them. The dwarves are confused by the soldiers' yellowish skin, black hair, and dark eyes, features unlike the humans they know. The soldiers in turn stare at them and remark that they resemble General Byuru and Yuru. Later, at a nearby blacksmith's forge, the dwarves examine a blade with disbelief, asking how a human could craft such a weapon. When Ko Jinshin group returns, and they look out the window, they are stunned to see Byuru and Yuru and immediately call them brothers. They explain that the legend of bronze-skinned, black-haired kin must have been true, which is why the weapons forged here resemble those of their people. Overcome with excitement, the three dwarves begin dancing in unison. Byuru and Yuru stand there confused and slightly offended, unsure how to react. Ko Jinshin pays little attention and walks toward the docks, reflecting on Huey's words and his brother's final request. Though he is of imperial blood, he was born illegitimate and spent half his life at war. The Goguryeo he tried to protect burned to ashes. He came here believing he was safeguarding the heir, only to discover the child was a girl and not even of his brother's bloodline. Yet the soldiers still believe in him. If this is the same world, he will build strength and strike the Tang. If it is not, he will continue the history of Goguryeo here. That will be his duty and purpose for those who follow him. He looks up at the sky at the moon flanked by 2 others, and smiles faintly. The dice has been cast. He turns and walks back inside. Some time later, a small settlement has taken shape. The soldiers are no longer dressed for battle, but in ordinary clothing. Huey notes that although the farmers were wary at first, they have grown close to the soldiers, close enough for some to fall in love. Within a month, the food shortage was resolved thanks to the seeds the farmers brought. The dwarves prove not only to be blacksmiths but skilled architects as well, solving the housing issue. They are impressed by the ironwork techniques and begin crafting various items under Old Man Jang. Bowing again to Buru and Yuru, Ko Jinshin remarks dryly that surely all of this is thanks to those two. Huey then brings up new concerns. They lack sufficient liquor and meat for an upcoming wedding ceremony as well as clothing and bows. Ko Jinshin asks for a solution. Huey explains that according to Vaughn, if they sneak into the city and sell the hides and bones of the monsters they have slain, they can earn money. With that, they can purchase what they cannot produce here, solving shortages of food, clothing, and weapons. Demuduk volunteers to go, but Huey suggests that since Demuduk is overwhelmed with responsibilities at the settlement, he will go himself and use the opportunity to survey the surrounding region. Ko Jinshin considers Huey's proposal, and before long they arrive at the city. Huey isn't alone this time. Ko Jinshin, Vaughn, and Jai Eungsam have come as well. Huey asks why he decided to come when he usually lets him handle these matters alone, teasing that he should just admit he was curious. Ko Jinshin brushes it off and tells them to move. As they approach with carriages trailing behind, a cloaked figure watches them silently from behind a tree. At the city gates, the man ahead of them is allowed entry. But when the guard spots Vaughn, he remarks that Vaughn has worked hard. Vaughn casually slips him a bribe, and the guard waves them forward. Just as they begin to pass through, the guard hesitates, frowns, and orders them to stop. He steps closer, lifting his spear to forcefully push back Ko Jinshin's hood. When the fabric falls away, the guard is visibly startled by his hair and skin color. Vaughn quickly hands over more coins, laughing it off as nothing unusual. The guard taps Ko Jinshin with the spear and tells him to move along. Once inside the city, Ko Jinshin asks for the guard's name. Vaughn tells him it was Kalsuman. Ko Jinshin mutters that he needs to remember that name. Huey chuckles, but then senses something off, and glances toward a nearby corner. Seeing nothing, but unbeknownst to them, the same cloaked man from the tree is watching, noting that the hides they carry are definitely from an ogre, and if so, they must have ogre blood as well. They enter a shop to sell their goods. The shopkeeper stares at Vaughn in disbelief, asking how he managed to kill an ogre when even 20 soldiers would struggle to bring one down. Vaughn tells him he'll share the story later and asks him to calculate the price first, adding whether he has any need for ogre blood. The shopkeeper says only wizards buy such things, and there's no way a wizard would be in a remote place like this. Right then, the cloaked figure bursts in, announcing that he'll buy it. Everyone is surprised to see an actual wizard here. He leaps forward, inspecting the blood and praising its condition, claiming that with it he can finally break free from the cursed second circle. He offers 3 bottles for 1 gold and 50 silver. The shopkeeper apologizes, saying that price won't work. The wizard nervously pulls out 1 gold and 90 silver instead, admitting it's everything he has, and begging them to accept. The shopkeeper accuses him of being a con artist trying to swindle them. Vaughn attempts to calm things down, but the wizard erupts, demanding to know how they dare insult him. He introduces himself dramatically as Rigel, the genius wizard said to appear once every 100 years. The shopkeeper scoffs, saying even third circle wizards are showered with gold, so how is someone calling himself a genius stuck at the second circle and broke? The insult clearly hits home. Rigel hunches over, muttering before chanting a spell, and casting a fireball. The shopkeeper flinches in shock as Rigel declares that though he remains in the second circle, insulting a wizard is still a grave sin. Before anything escalates further, a mug flies across the room and smashes into Rigel's face, knocking him flat. Ko Jinshin calmly asks if beggars in this town practice sorcery. Huey remarks that it seems more likely a sorcerer became a beggar. As Rigel lies unconscious, Huey comments that the magic system here is confusing. And now Rigel's backstory unfolds. Once hailed as a once-in-a-century genius, he mastered mana in half a year when others took 2. Becoming a grand wizard seemed inevitable until he stalled at the second circle. His master abandoned him, and he became an outcast wherever he went. Convinced there had to be a path forward, he devoted himself to study, accumulating knowledge rivaling archmages, yet he still could not surpass the second circle. Back to the present, they load him into the back of the carriage and head out of the city as he mutters in his sleep, pleading for his master not to abandon him and insisting that with ogre blood he reach the second circle. Huey asks if they're truly leaving early because of this old man. Ko Jinshin replies that wizards in this land are rare and knowledgeable. Huey asks if he kidnapped him out of fear someone else might claim him. Ko Jinshin denies it, saying he simply picked him up. Huey presses further, asking what he intends to do with him. Jinshin answers that if he's rare and valuable, why not bring him along? Rigel suddenly begins crying in his sleep. Before jolting awake, Jinshin notes that he's finally up and asks why he was crying. Huey dryly remarks that crying after being kidnapped is only natural. Jinshin says he was just asking. Rigel looks around frantically, wondering who these people are and what they plan to do with him. He scoffs, saying a mere rope cannot bind a wizard. His eyes glow as mana gathers and he flexes. Snapping the rope apart, he immediately casts Energy Bolt, declaring that even as a second circle spell, it's not to be underestimated. The spell hurtles toward Jinshin, who punches it with his bare fist, dispersing it instantly. Rigel stares in disbelief. Huey casually says block, and somehow it works exactly as spoken. Rigel sits there stunned at what just happened. Jinshin casually remarks, that was pretty cool, and Huey nods in agreement. Rigel, however, stares in disbelief, demanding to know what just happened to his spell. He asks how his magic was nullified. Then he activates an interpretation spell through a ring on his finger, and suddenly speaks in their language, asking who they are. Jinshin immediately questions how he can speak their tongue, but Rigel is more focused on how they blocked an energy bolt without a shield. Jinshin presses him again about the language, and Rigel explains that it's the power of his item and tells him not to worry about it. Jinshin replies that he had been concerned since they left the liar behind in the city, but he's relieved they can now communicate. Rigel, still obsessed, asks what formula was used to nullify his spell. Huey responds calmly that if he is also a shaman, then he should know it is rude to ask about another person's technique so carelessly. Rigel tries again, but Huey cuts him off. Before the conversation can continue, Huey notices a group of men approaching. He suggests they deal with their uninvited guests first. The group is led by none other than Calsuman. He smirks, saying it would be foolish to lose a steady source of income over a moment of greed. But the goods on their cart look valuable enough to justify the risk. Since they split up, he believes he can kill these two, seize the items, and keep the income stream intact. He calls them unlucky. Huey simply says shatter and two men's chests explode instantly. Holding up a talisman, he remains composed. As Jinshin dismounts and addresses Calsuman by name. Calsuman orders his men to attack. They charge forward. Huey throws 3 more talismans, and 3 more men are obliterated. Calsuman stands frozen. As Jinshin walks toward him, eyes locked, one man leaps from above, but Jinshin unsheathes his sword in a single motion and slices him clean in half. Calsuman screams for his men to stop them, but no one moves. Huey casts extinguished fire, and 3 more men are engulfed in flames, reduced to ash before his eyes. Horrified at what happened, Calsuman collapses to the ground. Jinshin stands over him, eye locked. As the enemy peed himself, Jinshin raises his sword, and as Calsuman screams, he brings it down, only to strike him in the head with the flat. Huey tells him to stop playing around, but Jinshin keeps tapping him over and over, venting his irritation from earlier at the gates. Huey finally insists they end it and leave. Calsuman dares to hope he might survive, but Jinshin pulls out a talisman and attempts the same spell Huey used. Calsuman shrieks, yet nothing happens, except the talisman burning up. Jinshin mutters that, as expected, he still cannot use it. Huey remarks that if just anyone could perform it, it wouldn't be called magic. Then he notices that Calsuman's heart has stopped. Rigel, meanwhile, is in awe. He mutters that Huey cast magic using only a trigger word without chanting. Then he realizes they are heading toward the mountains where a dragon is rumored to live, and begins convincing himself that Huey must be that dragon. If he could serve such a being and learn the origin of magic, he could surpass the second circle. Huey apologizes for kidnapping him and says if he dislikes it, he may try to kill him. Rigel instantly folds, insisting they must have brought him because they need him and that he will follow any order given. Jinshin and Huey exchange confused looks but let it be. When they reach the settlement near the port, Rigel is stunned by what he sees. A village this organized, with discipline and morale rivaling imperial soldiers. Buru and Yuru greet them, asking who the old man is. Rigel stares at the dwarves and demands to know what the Titan clan is doing here. Once again, Buru and Yuru are baffled by the title. Rigel explains that these dwarves were believed to have vanished after the god-demon war 1,000 years ago. Jinshin addresses him as a shaman, then corrects himself to mage, and reminds him that he attempted to harm Vaughn. Rigel protests that Vaughn insulted him, but Jinshin tells Buru and Yuru to take him to the execution grounds. As they drag him off, they ask where he found him, and Jinshin simply says he picked him up along the way. At the execution grounds, Jinshin clarifies that although he said he picked Rigel up, he did in fact kidnap him. However, he cannot forgive him for attempting to harm Vaughn, who guided one of his people. Rigel argues that they insulted him as a mage. Jinshin says he understands that part. Rigel thanks him too quickly, but Jinshin continues, explaining that by attempting to harm his servant, Rigel insulted him as well. Rigel demands to know how he can say that, but Jinshin replies that this world runs on survival of the fittest. It is not about good punishing evil, it is about the victor taking everything. Rigel grows anxious and retorts that a weakling who kidnaps others only hastens his own downfall. Jinshin asks if that is truly the right thing to say now, pointing out that he could have beaten him to death earlier and no one would have questioned it. Yet Rigel lacks the strength to earn respect as a mage. He asks if he is wrong. Rigel cannot argue. stuck in the second circle for 75 years. He admits that his entire life feels filled with regret. Ko Jinshin tells Rigel that he will give him a chance. He asks whether he intends to keep wandering like a beggar for the rest of his life, or try his luck staying here with him. Rigel looks confused and asks what he means. Ko Jinshin explains that more than an outstanding soldier, he needs a sage, someone who possesses deep knowledge of this world. As they stand at the execution grounds, Ko Jinshin tells him plainly that he will allow him to live, and asks if he will join him. Rigel remains silent. Ko Jinshin says he will ask one final time he needs him. Will he join his cause? Rigel asks what Ko Jinshin would do for him in return. Ko Jinshin answers that he does not stand by when someone mistreats his family or his people. If anyone dares to look down on him, he will smash them to pieces. Rigel's eyes begin to water. Slowly he bows, and declares that he will serve him as his master. Later that night, Rigel sits with Buru and Yuru, visibly confused. He admits that he expected to be treated as a servant, yet instead Ko Jinshin ordered him to teach the two of them. Buru and Yuru grumble, asking what they are supposed to learn at their age. Ko Jinshin replies that they cannot remain here forever. They must understand this land if they are to decide their path forward. Rigel misinterprets this, thinking Ko Jinshin is allowing him to teach members of the Titan clan, though that assumption is clearly his own misunderstanding. Ko Jinshin then tells Rigel that instead of relying on his item to translate, he must learn their language properly. Until then, Ko Jinshin will hold onto the ring. Rigel is startled and confused, and Ko Jinshin adds that he did not take it out of greed. Rigel mutters that he must have his reasons. After some time spent studying, Buru and Yuru both collapse from exhaustion. Rigel sighs and remarks that in the end, dwarves are still dwarves. At that moment, Ko Jinshin enters. Rigel greets him in their language. Ko Jinshin stares at him for a moment, then removes the ring and hands it back, saying it is broken. Before turning away, Rigel quickly slips it on and activates the spell, insisting that it is not broken at all. But Ko Jinshin has already left. I guess our boy has no luck with magic after all. Elsewhere that same night, Jae Eung-sam and Vaughn are returning. Jae Eung-sam suddenly senses something wrong and realizes they are walking into a trap. He tells Vaughn to stop, jumps down, and presses his ear to the ground, listening for movement. Vaughn asks what he is doing, and Jae Eung-sam confirms his suspicion. He tells Vaughn they are abandoning the cart. Strapping his sword to his chest, he urges him to hurry, unless he wants to die meaninglessly. They retreat into the nearby forest and watch from concealment. Soon enough, two knights from the city approach the abandoned cart, commenting that they cannot believe it was left behind and that the owners could not have gone far. They decide to spread out and search as they head into the woods toward them. Vaughn grows anxious. Jae Eung-sam calmly steps forward. Vaughn panics, thinking this might be the end. But when the noise subsides and he opens his eyes, he sees that Jae Eung-sam has already dealt with two of them. The last knight is pinned in place, unable to move. Vaughn realizes she underestimated him. Jae Eung-sam tells the captured knight to stay quiet. If he answers honestly, he will be allowed to return home to his wife and children. The knight awkwardly admits he is single. Jae Eung-sam stares at him. Before asking why they attacked, the knight explains that it was an order from the kingdom to conscript soldiers. Alvin has been capturing farmers to meet his quota. Jae Eung-sam deduces that this is why the mercenaries targeted Vaughn's village in the first place. The knight begs to be spared and then blurts out that he has a foxy lady waiting for him. Jae Eung-sam reminds him that he just said he was single. The knight nervously clarifies that he has a girlfriend. Jae Eung-sam considers whether to kill him, but lowers his blade, saying he will honor his promise since the questions were answered. However, it would be unsettling if he returned the same way. He instructs him to close his eyes and walk forward, counting to 1,000 before turning back. Vaughn questions whether this is wise, fearing that releasing him could lead to pursuit. Jae Eung-sam assures her that the man seems honest enough not to betray them. The knight eagerly agrees and walks away at full speed, happily singing, until his voice cuts off in a scream. Vaughn looks horrified. Jae Eung-sam laughs lightly and says the man should have been more careful. Now the dude got sent to meet his maker. Vaughn calls him a liar, but Jae Eung-sam shrugs and says he kept his word. Moments later, more soldiers arrive and discover their fallen comrade. They quickly surround Jae Eung-sam and Vaughn. Jae Eung-sam smiles wryly, wondering aloud why the heavens always seem to test a good person like him. One knight remarks that it is only two of them, and they should finish this quickly and return. As they begin closing in, Vaughn anxiously asks what he plans to do. Back at the village, Sarah rushes into Buru's quarters. He asks what she is doing there so late. She asks when her uncle is expected to return. Buru tells her it should be tomorrow. He can tell she is worried, and gently asks what is troubling her. Sarah admits that the road is dangerous, and that no one knows what the subjugation hunters might do next. Buru quickly guesses that she is worried about her uncle traveling with nothing but the liar. When she nods, he bursts into loud laughter. She frowns and asks what is so funny. Given Jae Eung-sam's history, trust does not come easily. Meanwhile, Jae Eung-sam sighs in the forest and draws his blade, muttering that nothing ever goes smoothly. Jae Eung-sam may spout nothing but lies, Still, he once served under General Jayabek, one of the strongest warriors. Jai Ungsam dashes forward in a blur, decapitating every enemy in his path. Vaughn stands speechless. Jai Ungsam tells him it is time to move. He is still processing what he just saw but feels a surge of excitement. Suddenly, an earth-shaking roar echoes through the forest. Vaughn stiffens, whispering that it cannot be here. A massive foot steps into view. It is a twin-headed ogre. Memories of the last ogre flood her mind and panic sets in. He forces himself to stay calm. Even if it is the king of land monsters with Jai Ungsam here, it might still be manageable. He turns to him only to see him sprinting into the woods so fast, even Usain Bolt might have a hard time catching up. In that instant, he realizes he has been completely fooled by this idiot. Back at camp, Ko Jinshin ends the meeting for the day, when a soldier bursts in with urgent news. Smoke is rising from the northern watchtower. Ko Jinshin asks for more details. The report suggests that something has happened to the nearby village they trade with. It is less than half a day away by horseback. Ko Jinshin decides they cannot ignore it any longer. They will determine friend or foe upon arrival. A minimum force will remain behind for defense. Everyone else will mobilize. It is a full mobilization order. Rigel rushes over confused, only to see soldiers already lined up in formation. He is stunned by how quickly they prepared. Ko Jinshin mounts his horse and positions himself before his troops. As they stand in disciplined ranks, Rigel, who has traveled across the continent, admits he has never seen troops so orderly. The aura they radiate rivals even the Imperial Knights. Ko Jinshin asks if they are ready. Buru urges him to give the order. Ko Jinshin instructs Yuru to bring Rigel along. He then asks Rigel whether, despite seeing the world, has he ever truly seen a battlefield. Rigel answers that he has. Ko Jinshin tells him to observe their war today and judge how their tactics differ. Rigel feels the weight behind those simple words. Though Ko Jinshin smells of blood, he is composed, every syllable sharp and clear. Rigel bows deeply and responds, "Yes, my lord." Ko Jinshin gives the command to ride. Buru and Yuru hype the troops, and as the gates open, they march out in force. At the nearby village, Alvin and his men have rounded up all but the fighting-age men and very young women. Alvin orders Tilluman to kill them. Archers draw their bows and release flaming arrows, setting the village ablaze. Alvin remarks that this village is too small. Tilluman reports that prisoners spoke of a larger settlement nearby. Alvin smiles and says that if that is true, it will make for a pleasant hunt. As they prepare to move toward Ko Jinshin's camp, Alvin finishes overseeing the destruction. Back in the forest, Jai Ungsam and Von narrowly avoid the twin-headed ogre as it stomps past them. Jai Ungsam mutters, wondering what sin he committed to deserve this. Von sighs in relief, saying at least they shook off the ogre. Just then Von hears something strange and spots a small goblin-like creature. T seems they have wandered into monster territory. Jai Ungsam suggests they leave quickly, but the goblin smacks him in the head with a rock. Irritated, he kicks the goblin like Prime Ronaldo, sending it straight to heaven. Von tries to warn him that baby goblins are raised in goblin villages, and that they should not provoke them, but it is too late, the rest are now furious. Jai Ungsam regrets not listening. Meanwhile, Ko Jinshin and his forces arrive at the burned village. Nothing remains but ash. He orders Huey to rest briefly and remain alert for ambushes. Rigel examines an arrowhead and notes the crest. It belongs to Baron Alvin's private soldiers. Ko Jinshin nods. He has heard that Alvin has been capturing farmers in this region and asks Rigel if he knows why. Rigel explains that armies rarely venture, because the monsters are ferocious and numerous. Sending a large force would result in heavy casualties. Rigel explains that because the city at the mountain's entrance is a commercial hub, it has little need for slaves under normal circumstances. But now the purpose is different. They are gathering manpower for war. In cities where commerce flourishes, wealthy families often try to shield their sons from conscription. It has become common practice to purchase serfs or slaves and send them to the battlefield in their children's place, often with bribes to secure the arrangement. The captured farmers are likely meant to serve as expendable bodies in war. Ko Jinshin calls them insane, questioning how they expect to win with such methods. Rigel answers calmly that the Heian kingdom likely does not care whether it wins or loses. When Ko Jinshin demands clarification, Rigel explains that this kingdom borders two massive empires and faces a maritime empire across the sea. It has always survived by bending to whichever power is strongest at the time. In war, they simply provide troops to both sides. Victory or defeat does not matter, only survival under foreign influence. That is the reality of the Heian kingdom, a land no one truly protects. Ko Jinshin mutters that it is tragic they have already abandoned the idea of being a nation. The scout approaches, reporting that they have located an enemy encampment. Approximately 20 cavalry and 600 infantry. Around 250 kidnapped villagers are confined in wagons, and the enemy appears to be resting before moving on to another settlement. Ko Jinshin nods. That makes things simple. Tonight will be long. At Alvin's camp, the prisoners are being tortured for sport. Soldiers laugh as they beat them mercilessly. Some begin stripping and advancing toward the women. One mockingly offers food and wine to anyone willing to step forward, but when no one moves, he grabs a woman by force. At the perimeter, guards complain about being stuck on duty instead of joining the fun. One remarks that his lower half has been aching since earlier. The mood shifts slightly, as a strange tension settles over the fog. One mocks the other for being afraid. Then an arrow pierces both of them in a single shot, sending both to the ground. Another guard turns in confusion, striking an exaggerated pose, before taking an arrow straight to the head as well. Huey and his men step from the shadows. It is time to send the signal. Carrier pigeons are released into the night sky. From a distance, Ko Jinshin sees the signal and confirms the escape route is secured. He tells Rigel to observe carefully. This is how they wage war. Yuru and the archer unit draw their bows. Yuru grins and orders the volley. Countless arrows soar into the dark sky. The enemy soldiers remain careless at first, hearing only a faint whistling. One looks up, unable to see anything in the darkness. He dismisses it as nothing, until arrows begin tearing through them. Half the camp collapses in chaos. Survivors scramble to arms. Alvin storms out, demanding answers. A panicked soldier collides with him, but Tillman quickly steps in, urging Alvin to retreat to safety. Alvin, visibly shaken, orders him to restore order immediately. Tillman takes command and start barking orders. Archers are to return fire toward the source. Spearmen must hold the entry point. He demands to know what kind of enemy would dare strike like this. The thunder of approaching horses grows louder. Tillman narrows his eyes. The presence of cavalry means these are not mere farmers. Ko Jinshin rides at the front, drawing his bow. Tillman scoffs, assuming they are amateurs. Firing from horseback is reckless. He orders his men to hold until they are within range, then fill them with arrows. But Ko Jinshin's unit fires first. Tillman calls them fools for shooting from so far, until an arrow slices past his face. Forcing him to twist out of the way, his men lack his reflexes. They drop one after another. Tillman stares in disbelief. It makes no sense. Ko Jinshin releases another arrow as the cavalry barrels forward. Tillman raises his guard, but every arrow that slips past him claims another soldier's life. He shouts for the spearmen to halt the charge. Ko Jinshin responds instantly, ordering a wedge formation. The cavalry tightens and drives forward like a blade. His horse does not hesitate, crashing straight into the spear line and shattering their front ranks. Tillman yells for his men to strike the horses, but when one thrusts his spear, it bounces harmlessly off iron plating. The horses are armored head to hoof. Fear spreads. The soldiers begin whispering that Ko Jinshin and his army are devils. Screams echo as horses trample skulls into the dirt. The formation collapses under the overwhelming force. Ko Jinshin commands his men to pierce through completely, and then turns to Buru, telling him to prepare. Yuru answers confidently that he can count on him, and Ko Jinshin nods. Before charging again, Ko Jinshin shouts that they have come to rescue the farmers. The cavalry surges forward once more, riding cleanly through the divided spear lines and splitting the enemy force in two. One of the enemy soldiers suddenly shouts in excitement, thinking that since the cavalry has ridden past, this might be their chance. But Buru tilts his head, wondering what this bastard is so happy about, and calmly orders his men to charge. The shield bearers advance first, forming a solid wall as they march forward. The enemy spearmen brace themselves, thrusting desperately, but they are completely overwhelmed by sheer strength. The shield unit pushes forward like a moving fortress, driving the spearmen back step by step. At the same time, other soldiers slip through the gaps between the shields, cracking skulls and cutting down enemies with ruthless efficiency. One spearman screams and lunges forward, but the soldier in front of him doesn't even bother defending. He trusts the man behind him completely. As the spear pierces through, killing him, the dying soldier's final thought is confusion over who these monsters truly are. The slaughter continues without resistance. Alvin steps out of his tent and watches the massacre unfold. Judging by their armor, they are not Imperial troops, yet he has no idea who they are. Tillman rushes over, urging immediate retreat to the rear. Alvin snarls that he will make them pay. Once he returns to his territory, he will gather the kingdom's full army and crush them. Another soldier runs up, and Tillman quickly demands confirmation that the escape route is secured. The answer is grim: there's a problem. Back within the camp, the captured farmers stare in disbelief as they watch the soldiers fleeing for their lives. Huey and his unit advance steadily from behind the retreating enemy, while Ko Jinshin's cavalry cuts them off from the front. Huey remarks that he's glad Ko Jinshin arrived in time. Ko Jinshin tells him good work and orders the wagons secured. The cavalry will regroup with him shortly. In desperation, one enemy soldier drops to a crouch and grabs a torch. He screams that he refuses to die like this, that if it's because of the farmers, then they can all burn together. The farmers panic as he charges toward the wagons. Huey realizes he cannot let the man close the distance. As the soldier roars that they will burn alive in agony, Huey raises his hand and casts a spell. His eyes glow bright orange, and the flames twist unnaturally in the air, warping away from their path and surging back onto the attacker. The fire engulfs him instantly, burning him down to a blackened skeleton in moments. The farmers stand frozen, whispering in shock that their savior is a mage. Soon after, Ko Jinshin and his men round up the remaining soldiers. The battlefield is nothing but corpses. Yoru grins, as Tillman notes grimly that of 600 men, barely 100 survived the charge. Alvin demands to know if they realize who he is, a noble of the kingdom. The soldiers remain silent. The The bastard Alvin assumes it's because they fear treating him improperly, so he tries to press his advantage, invoking the laws of war and demanding to see their commander. The men shift aside. As Ko Jinshin steps forward, Alvin squints, asking if he is the one in command. Our MC doesn't even bother answering the bastard's question, which irritates him even further. Instead, he calls for the liar, but Buru informs him that Jai Ung-sam has not yet returned from the village. Ko Jinshin then tells Rigel to hand over the ring. Rigel complies but reminds him that he must say the trigger word exactly to activate it. Ko Jinshin puts it on and bluntly repeats what he remembers. Rigel stares at him in disbelief, wondering if he's serious. Ko Jinshin asks Alvin whether he can understand him, but Rigel quickly corrects him that wasn't the trigger word. Confused, Ko Jinshin insists that's what he was told. Rigel sighs and instructs him to repeat after him. Interpretation. Ko Jinshin attempts it, with stiff, broken pronunciation. Meanwhile, Tillman starts to whisper something into Alvin's ear. Alvin's expression slowly shifts into a satisfied smile as he hears the plan. Rigel leans close to Ko Jinshin, insisting he pronounce it carefully, letter by letter. This time, Ko Jinshin says it slowly and precisely. And finally, the ring glows faintly. Rigel claps in excitement. It worked. Ko Jinshin turns to Alvin and asks if he can hear him now. Alvin confirms that he can. Tillman steps forward and formally introduces himself as Knight Hugelian Tillman of House Baron Alvin. Ko Jinshin responds in kind, declaring himself Disaja Ko Jinshin of the Great Goguryeo Empire. Tillman repeats the name skeptically. There is no country called Goguryeo on this continent, yet he dares to call it an empire. Ko Jinshin calmly asks if they intend to continue this. Tillman replies that victory and defeat have already been decided, so there is no need to prolong it, but he has one request. He challenges Ko Jinshin to a one-on-one duel. If he wins, Ko Jinshin must withdraw peacefully. Ko Jinshin finds the duel interesting and accepts as a warrior. Tillman thanks him. Alvin smiles inwardly. The duel is unfolding exactly as Tillman planned. Tillman is renowned within the kingdom. If they capture the enemy leader, they can reverse everything. Ko Jinshin steps down and walks through the enemy ranks toward Tillman without hesitation. Tillman draws his blade, aura flaring as he coats it in energy. Rigel stiffens, whispering that this man has skill comparable to the royal guard. Tillman asks if Ko Jinshin is prepared. Ko Jinshin simply tells him to come forward. Rigel shouts for him to dodge. Tillman is an aura user, but Tillman has already closed the distance, roaring that it's too late as he brings his blade down in a decisive strike. Ko Jinshin calmly tracks the path of the blade. At the last instant, he swings upward. The clash rings out and Tillman's aura-coated sword shatters instantly, fragments flying into the air. One shard even nearly impales Alvin. Tillman freezes, cold sweat pouring down his face, heart pounding wildly. He stammers in disbelief. How can a sword strike with such force without aura? Ko Jinshin lowers his blade and looks down at him with complete disdain, calling him pathetic. Alvin rushes forward, grabbing Tillman by the collar and demanding to know what he is doing. But the moment he pulls him close, he notices something is wrong. A thin line of blood begins to form between Tillman's eyes. In the next instant, his body splits cleanly down the middle, cleaved from head to waist. Blood drenches Alvin as Tillman's corpse falls apart before him. Alvin collapses in horror, slowly lifting his gaze to Ko Jinshin. And in that moment, he sees exactly what his soldiers saw. A devil standing before him. Ko Jinshin calmly asks if they are finished now, glaring down at him. Alvin trembles so violently that he soils himself. Rigel mutters that although it was invisible to the eye, the surge of mana in that instant far surpassed mere aura. Yuru laughs, saying that even in a backwater like this, fools are leaking energy everywhere. The soldiers join in the laughter. Ko Jinshin gives the order to withdraw, and his men respond in unison. Old man Rigel is still in disbelief. Just who are these people? As they ride back, with the rescued settlers trailing behind, Rigel remains deep in thought. No matter how much he analyzes it, nothing adds up. He prides himself on knowing nearly every faction across the continent, yet a force this powerful has never once appeared in his records. He asks Yuru where they truly came from. Yuru repeats that they came from Goguryeo. Rigel presses further, asking where Goguryeo is located. Yuru explains that they arrived by boat, and indicates the direction. Rigel's excitement quickly fades because in that direction it's just a lake. There is no outlet to the sea. He insists there is no way out, no possible route that could lead to another land. Yet Yuru calmly tells him that is exactly what happened. As he recounts how they pushed through a wall of water in a storm and emerged into the mountain lake, Rigel's mind races. A sea, a wall of water, a landlocked lake. He mutters under his breath, could it be? When they return to camp, the soldiers shout that Disaja Ko Jinshin has returned, and the gates are thrown open. Suddenly, Jai Ung-sam bursts forward. Screaming Ko Jinshin's name at the top of his lungs, he falls to his knees, declaring that disaster has struck. Troops from the city have been dispatched to capture the farmers, and they must gather their forces immediately. Ko Jinshin looks down at him silently. Jai Ung-sam insists there is no time, and explains that he ran without rest to deliver this warning. Ko Jinshin stares at him for another long moment, then simply ignore the con man. Confused, Jai Ung-sam looks up, only for Buru to tell him he is beating the after drum, when he asks what that means. Buru repeats that they are already returning from hunting down and killing them all. He tells him to go wash up and stop looking like a beggar. Later that day, Jai Eung-sam tries to explain properly. He says that while reporting this matter, he cut down all the pursuers. Ko Jinshin asks what happened next. Jai Eung-sam claims a giant two-headed monster chased him. Ko Jinshin asks again. Jai Eung-sam boasts that, being lightning fast, he escaped, only to be chased by thousands of blue creatures. Ko Jinshin calmly asks what happened next. The story shrinks to hundreds, then dozens. Each time Ko Jinshin asks, the number seemed to dwindles. Eventually, Jai Eung-sam runs out of embellishments. Ko Jinshin states plainly that Jai Eung-sam abandoned all the goods they had painstakingly gathered from months of hunting and returned alone. Panicking, Jai Eung-sam scratches his head and blames it all on a man named Alvin. Ko Jinshin recognizes the name immediately and tells Huey to bring over the one who wet himself. Huey asks why. Ko Jinshin says he has questions. Soon, Baron Alvin is dragged forward, the interpretation ring on his finger allowing him to speak fluently. He protests that they cannot treat a kingdom noble this way. According to international law, captured nobles must be handled according to their status. Ko Jinshin glances at Rigel, and strangely enough, Rigel confirms that he is technically correct. So Ko Jinshin nods, and says he will treat him well. Alvin quickly seizes the opportunity. If they release him now, he will offer a ransom of 1,000 gold. More than that, he will petition the king to grant them autonomy over this region. Ko Jinshin admits that they do need a stable place to settle. Alvin sweetens the offer further, saying that since they appear unaffiliated, he is willing to take them in as his subordinates. Buru and Yuru erupt in anger, threatening to make him wet himself again. Ko Jinshin silences them at once, reminding them not to be rude to Baron Alvin. Though they obey, their glares do not soften. Ko Jinshin asks Alvin if he truly intends to take them in. Alvin assures him they would receive the finest treatment. As Ko Jinshin appears to consider it, Alvin smiles inwardly. If he plays this well, he could acquire elite troops beyond anything the kingdom possesses. Ko Jinshin apologizes for the hardships Alvin endured and orders his men to release his bonds. Once freed, Alvin straightens himself proudly, declaring that enduring hardship for talent is the virtue of a true lord. Ko Jinshin thanks him for his generosity, but says there is one concern. Alvin asks what troubles him. Ko Jinshin steps closer and says he is worried that his subordinates might clash with the existing soldiers of Alvin's territory. Alvin quickly assures Ko Jinshin that there will be no conflict. His territory currently has only security forces, all directly under his control. How could any problem arise? And as for the food issue, Alvin confidently claims his estate holds enough provisions to sustain troops of this size for over half a year. Ko Jinshin nods, saying he is relieved to hear that. He tells Alvin to rest and orders the restraint around his neck removed. Then he instructs his men to escort the Baron to where the captured farmers are being held. Rigel quietly warns that Alvin might be beaten to death there. Ko Jinshin replies that if that happens, it will simply be his fate. He orders that everyone will march the morning after tomorrow, so everyone should be prepared. When Rigel asks where they are headed, Ko Jinshin answers with a thin smile that the liar needs to recover both the principal and interest for the cart he lost. Huey smiles, so do Buru and Yuru. Ko Jinshin's expression turns almost villainous as he remarks that with their territory currently underdefended, this is the perfect opportunity. After all, isn't plunder the most enjoyable part of war? Later, Alvin pounds against the gate of the enclosure, shouting that this must be a mistake. He reminds them he is to become their lord and demands to be released immediately. When he turns, he realizes the farmers he had imprisoned are all staring at him in silence. He sneers at them, calling them lowly creatures, and orders one to fetch him water. The man does not move. Alvin sighs in annoyance, walks over, and kicks him hard in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. He begins stomping him, calling him trash. The man bleeds and begs for mercy. Can't hold it any longer, one prisoner lunges forward in rage. But someone restrains him, reminding him that a soldier had warned them earlier that anyone who touched Alvin would be killed. The man trembles, remembering how Alvin's forces slaughtered his loved ones. Once again, he must watch this tyrant act without consequence. Alvin glares at them, trying to reassert control. When the man from earlier approaches again, Alvin demands to know how he dares glare at him. The villager can't take this bullshit any further, punches him square in the face, sending him flying back against the bars. The man slumps, blood pouring from his head. Alvin finally senses danger and begins screaming for the guards. The man rises behind him. Alvin stammers that he is sorry and begs to explain. The man replies that apologies are meaningless. He can atone only with his death. Then he begins beating Alvin mercilessly. In the next day, all the prisoners kneel before Ko Jinshin. Their leader Hawk stands bound, Alvin's corpse lying nearby. Ko Jinshin asks Hawk why he killed him. Hawk remains silent until a guard grabs his head and slams him into the ground. Stomping him, Ko Jinshin repeats the question. Hawk demands to know whether he was supposed to simply stand by and watch his enemy live. Ko Jinshin smiles faintly and says revenge is a right granted to humans. Then he asks Hawk whether he considers himself human. Hawk looks confused. Ko Jinshin replies that insects cannot speak of revenge. He asks who else laid hands on Alvin. Hawk insists he acted alone. Ko Jinshin nods, And with that, Hawk is carried away. Yuru follows from behind. As the remaining prisoners tremble, Ko Jinshin states coldly that one noble's life equals 10 of theirs. If 9 more volunteer to die, he will guarantee the rest live. Panic erupts as men shout that they will sacrifice themselves. But the air grows heavy. As Ko Jinshin steps forward and the shouting dies down, he repeats himself 9 more lives for the rest. One man stands and offers himself, asking only that his family be spared. Ko Jinshin replies calmly 8 more. The man is taken to the chopping block. Buru steps forward with his axe and tells him to hold tight. The man closes his eyes. As the axe falls, the sound echoes through the camp. Another steps forward, the same man Alvin had kicked earlier. 7, Ko Jinshin says. Again the axe falls. Then 6, 5, 4. Each time the sound of the blade striking fills the air. Finally, Ko Jinshin declares they are 4 short. Yet no one moves. He turns to Huey and says the families of the 6 who sacrificed themselves will be given homes and livelihoods. They will become his people. The rest will be imprisoned and used as slaves. He calls them worthless trash. But elsewhere, Hawk lies recovering. Vaughn approaches and asks if he is awake. Hawk asks how he is alive. Vaughn says it is a long story and they can speak after he regains his strength. Confused, he asks again how he survived. Vaughn explains that it was a test. Hawk frowns, asking what kind of test that could be. Vaughn tells him that he and the 5 others who volunteered will live as citizens with their families. The rest will live as slaves. Hawk says it was insane, the pain felt real. He was certain he was dying. All of them are alive, but strangely have a diddy wound on them. Vaughn laughs and explains that Ko Jinshin never intended to kill them. It was a test to see whether they truly had the will to sacrifice themselves. But for the test to work, it had to feel real. So Buru carried it out. Hawk asks if she means the giant axe-wielding dwarf. Vaughn nods. It was nothing more than a brutal diddy strike. Nearby, Buru calmly cleans the blade of his axe. Jai Ungsam comments that it is filthy. Buru asks if he wants to know why he did it. Of course he does. Buru grins and says there is nothing he cannot tell him. And when Jai Ungsam asks why, Buru replies that it is his turn to try it out. Jai Ungsam immediately bolts, but Buru grabs him by the collar. As his life flashes before his eyes, Buru's grin widens. And with that, another one falls victim to Buru the diddler. Life soon settles into rhythm. The farmers work the fields and Buru sits with Sarah. She asks why some of the villagers became slaves. Buru explains that when the general first accepted them, he said they would only be taken in if they could wield a sword. If someone cannot sacrifice themselves for others, they will fail when the real enemy arrives. For humans, taking up a sword is the most basic act, and therefore the most important. He once asked Disaja Ko Jinshin a similar question. In the flashback, Ko Jinshin tells him that survival is something anyone can achieve, but freedom is not something everyone can enjoy. Yuru finds that difficult to understand. Ko Jinshin tells him to look at the pigs locked in pens, feed them, and they repeat the same behavior until the day they die. But wild boars in the forest resist when hunted, not merely to survive, but because they know freedom. If captured and locked away, they ram their heads against the fence. Why? Because they understand what they have lost. Even beasts struggle for freedom. Long ago, humans lived freely without borders or nations, following Huanung's teaching to benefit all humankind. But greed took root, traders sought prosperity for themselves, and bloody history began. Freedom was suppressed and enslaved. That is why one must always remember the reason for drawing a sword. Without purpose, no one can become strong. A sword must be drawn to protect freedom, and to do that one must first understand it. The weight of a sword wielded by someone who knows freedom is different from that of someone who does not. They must raise their swords together for Goguryeo's free will. The flashback fades. Buru tells Sarah that they wield swords to protect. If they are weak, they cannot protect anything. The nearby farmers and soldiers listen in awe. Buru pats Sarah's head and promises to protect her. She laughs, saying that is her favorite thing to hear. 3 days later, under the cover of night, they march toward Alvin's estate. Rigel notes that they crossed what should have been a week's distance in only 3 days without showing exhaustion. It would make sense for cavalry, but even the archers, who usually travel on foot, ride with skill and discipline. At that moment, Yuru calls him over, saying Ko Jinshin wishes to speak with him. Rigel approaches, quietly admiring. The commander's back. Ko Jinshin says this world is not the one they knew. Rigel must have already realized they are not from here. Rigel nods and agree. The stars form different constellations, the moons are different. Even the language is unfamiliar. Though his magical talent may be lacking, Rigel prides himself on his knowledge. Not once has he ever heard of an empire named Goguryeo. Ko Jinshin asks whether there is a Tang dynasty here. Rigel says there is not. Ko Jinshin lists Beach, Silla, Beetle, Han. Rigel has heard of none of them. Silence stretches between them. Finally, Ko Jinshin asks the question weighing on him. If none of those nations exist, then where exactly are they, and what world have they come to? Rigel tells him that this land is called the Heian continent, and from everything he can deduce, his lord has crossed a dimensional barrier. In other words, he has stepped into an entirely different world. 10,000 years ago, the ancient dragon Bersizire traveled across this world and established spatial coordinates throughout every land. There exists a spell known as warp, magic that allows movement through space using those coordinates. However, none of the empires Ko Jinshin has spoken of exist within any known coordinate. That leaves only one conclusion: this is another dimension entirely. Ko Jinshin asks what a dragon is, and why anyone would believe in such a thing simply because it supposedly accomplished great feats. Rigel explains that dragons are a superior race, ancient beings that exist beyond ordinary creatures. That is simply what they are called, dragons. Ko Jinshin asks if they are gods. Rigel says not exactly, but on this continent, no nation and no army can stand against them. Ko Jinshin chuckles at that. Rigel asks what he finds amusing. Ko Jinshin replies that even if their appearance is different, a dragon is still a dragon, and it is ridiculous that a world like this would bow to mere beasts. Ko Jinshin taps the crest engraved on his armor and asks if he knows what it represents. Rigel studies it and says it resembles a three-legged bird. Ko Jinshin tells him it is the Samjoko, a divine beast that feeds on dragons. It is the emblem engraved not only on their armor but on their hearts. Rigel's eyes widen. Ko Jinshin places a hand on his shoulder and tells him there is no need to fear some strange-looking lizard. He should remember that. Rigel remains silent, watching as Ko Jinshin turns and walks back through the trees, toward his horse and his men. A faint smile touches Ko Jinshin's lips. If the place they came from is now unreachable, then there is no empire left behind to worry about. He looks up at the unfamiliar moons and understands that this is where he will live from now on. Soon, the troops advance on foot, closing in on Alvin's territory. When they reach the walls, they scale them effortlessly with their enhanced strength, moving like shadows in the night. Weapons are drawn in silence. Jai Eungsam leads the charge toward the guards, who had just been complaining about how exhausting their duty has been. One guard suddenly stops mid-sentence. His companion turns to ask what is wrong, only to see him collapse from a brutal strike. Jai Eungsam clamps a hand over the second guard's mouth, whispering for him to stay quiet. He asks how many guards are on duty and promises that if he answers honestly, he will grant whatever he wishes. The man nods frantically and says there are 12 total, with 5 standby troops inside the building below the wall. Jai Eungsam asks what he wants in return. The man begs for his life. Jai Eungsam asks if that is all. The guard hesitates, then nervously asks for some money so he can settle somewhere far away. Jai Eungsam presses him again. The man adds that perhaps a horse and a little extra money would be nice. Jai Eungsam agrees. The guard begins to thank him, only for Jai Eungsam to drive a blade into his chest. The man gasps, asking why, saying he promised. Jai Eungsam calmly replies that he did promise and he is still listening, so the man can continue making requests. With his final breath, the guard calls him nothing but a liar. As his body falls limp, Jai Eungsam mutters that he is tired of hearing that. The other soldiers nearby agree he truly is a liar. They light the signal. Yuru spots it and informs Ko Jinshin that it is time. Ko Jinshin tightens the reins of his horse and orders his men to move swiftly and quietly, striking only Alvin's estate. Under the quiet, starry sky, the city wall was already littered with fallen guards. A thin trail of dust along the road below showed that the ones responsible were already racing for the gate. Inside the gatehouse, the heavy portcullis rattled as it was dragged upward, turning what should have been a barrier into a welcome sign for the attackers. The ghost cavalry dug in their heels and surged forward, iron hooves tearing up the dirt the instant the path opened. At the base of the wall, the side gate yawned wide, and the black riders poured toward it while the bodies of the watchmen lay scattered above, with no one left alive to raise an alarm. Ko Jinshin rode through the archway at a steady pace, ironclad and calm, as if he were entering a camp he already owned. Inside the yard, a squad stood lined up to receive him, and their leader stepped forward and bowed with an arm across his chest, making it clear that the gate was now his. The commander ordered the squad to keep this entrance under control and send the rest of the men to lock down every other way into the city. The soldiers answered as one, then broke into a run, rushing past the waiting horses to secure the remaining gates before a single soul could slip away. Ko Jinshin lifted his gaze to the cold night sky and ordered each squad to spread out, creep toward their assigned targets, and quietly erase any patrols they encountered. The ranks roared in response, and the officers repeated the final order. The moment the signal arrow lit the sky, they were to strike. Around their commander, the riders split into smaller groups and drifted into the dark streets they had been assigned. Ko Jinshin rode at the head of a single column, guiding his chosen squad straight toward the place that mattered most. His eye narrowed, calm and sharp, already measuring how the city would look once it belonged to Goguryeo. Then, while staring at the spires under the stars, the warlord gave a simple command, and the raid truly began. Hooves hammered against stone as Ko Jinshin drove his armored riders through the street, their lances and cloaks slicing through the dust like the edge of a storm. Farther out, a small squad sat in a loose circle around their fires, warming their hands as they waited for the arrow that would tell them it was time to move. The old man stared into the flames, brows knit tight as he weighed his part in the coming attack. Riding beside him, the Ko Jinshin said he would leave a few soldiers there, and that the old man's role was to stay put until the fighting was over. When the old man asked what exactly he was supposed to do, the Jinshin explained that once the looting began, he wanted him to sort through everything they seized and pick out the pieces that were truly valuable. The riders, after all, were charging straight for the grand house said to belong to someone named Alvin, the real prize of the night. Jinshin pointed out that once they tore through that place, there would be a mountain of goods, and between the two of them, only the old man knew which items were actually worth keeping. The main reason is that they need those books and maps to survive in this new world. An old man, Rigel, will be the one responsible. Fire curled around the old man's hands as he worked his craft, and he thought about how his master had already chosen this land as the place where they would put down roots. Then an arrow whistled high across the starry sky toward the city. The old man looked up from the flames and calmly said that it had begun. Beside him, a guard watched the glowing trail fade and muttered that using the sound of an arrow as a signal was a strange choice for an attack this large. The old man's eye narrowed, and he let out a short sound, as though that simple signal had just revealed something deeper about his master's style. Then, without warning, he bolted away from the fire, shouting that they had to reach the castle immediately. The guard hurried after him, demanding to know why he was suddenly so alarmed. The old mage cursed himself as the answer finally clicked into place. A place this far from the capital would almost certainly have a communication mage ready to warn the kingdom. The guard tried to calm him, saying they would cut off the beacon towers and messenger posts first, but the old mage exploded, calling him a fool and shouting that this was magic, a spell that could send word in an instant. The guard froze as the word magic sank in, and a cold bead of sweat slid down his cheek. The old mage drove in his heels, and the horse shot forward, leaving the guard behind as he tore across the dark field toward the castle. Back at the camp, soldiers and horses stirred in confusion while a single rider carved a bright path away from them, pushing his mount as though every heartbeat mattered. As the wind lashed across his face, the old mage clung to one thought alone. He had to stop the communication mage before any warning reached the kingdom. His jaw tightened as he pictured what would happen if he failed, convinced that not a single person on their side would survive once the kingdom moved in force. Out on the open plain, the riders thundered toward the sleeping city, every hoofbeat racing against the message that might already be flying ahead of them. At the mansion, across the bridge, the black-armored ghost cavalry advanced like a single dark wave, shields locked and lances lowered, while the panicked guards shouted for the line to form before that wall of iron crashed into them. A heartbeat later, the charge hit with crushing force. Horses and men collided in a violent heap as the defenders screamed to block them and hold the line, even while their front ranks were already being ripped apart. One armored rider blasted through the tangle of spears, seized a guard and cut him down in one savage strike, making it brutally clear that anyone who resisted would die just as quickly. The moment the spear wall broke, the ghost cavalry poured into the grounds from every direction, trampling scattered guards and turning the once quiet mansion garden into a roaring battlefield. A few defenders planted their spears and thrust upward at a towering warhorse, trying to drag its rider down even as the beast smashed through their ranks like a living battering ram. One warrior launched himself from the saddle and slammed into a guard like a falling boulder, driving the man into the ground so hard that his armor buckled, and the fight left him instantly. Nearby, an older officer dragged himself across the stones, teeth clenched, as riders thundered past, and the only thought in his mind was that a cavalry this overwhelming had appeared out of nowhere to tear his world apart. Jinshin barked out fresh orders, sending Yuru to seize the inside of the mansion before anyone within could react. Yuru roared back in reply and sprinted for the main doors, his soldiers thundering after him as they broke away from the chaos outside. While the rest of the ghost cavalry crushed the last pockets of resistance in the yard, Yuru and his men stormed up the steps toward the glowing entrance. Yuru had no use for handles or keys. He drove his boot into the grand door and blasted it inward with one brutal kick. Then he charged straight through the splintered entrance, his armored spearmen flooding in behind him to sweep the halls before anyone inside could escape. In the corridor, Yuru snarled that if even a single enemy slipped past them, every man there would pay for it, driving home that failure was not an option. Guards spread across the marble foyer, splitting into groups to secure the stairways and doors until the once proud hall felt less like a noble home and more like an occupied fortress. With the entrance locked down, Yuru led a smaller team down the inner stairs, heading for the heart of the mansion where anyone important would be trying to hide. The squad leader eased up to a closed door and listened closely as the quiet hallway pressed in around him. His eyes hardened and he signaled for his men to stay close, certain that something worth finding lay beyond that door. He stepped into the narrow brick passage, immediately noting how its blind corners made it the perfect route for cowards trying to slip away. Then he led his spearmen down the winding stairs, their boots echoing against the stone as they pressed deeper in pursuit of any fleeing targets. Partway down, the leader snapped his fist into the air, freezing the line the moment he caught a faint sound below. Holding his breath, he sharpened his hearing, trying to make out exactly what was happening in the darkness ahead. Then he quietly ordered the nearest spearman to hold that position with the others, while he moved on alone, pressing himself against the cold wall. A moment later, he caught it clearly at last, a muffled voice complaining that someone was struggling too much. That was all the proof he needed. Their prey was just around the bend. He knocked an arrow, fingers tightening around the string as they descended. The squad followed their leader through the cramped stairwell, ready to strike anything that moved below. Slipping out from the side passage, the archer pressed his back to the stone and drew his bow. He aimed down the empty hall, waiting for the source of those voices to reveal itself. From inside the dark cell, the bald guy spotted Yuru at the far end of the corridor. He tensed at once, knowing that whoever this man was, he had not come to talk. An instant later, the arrow punched through the bars and buried itself in his chest, hurling him backward. Yuru did not even slow down. He snatched up his bow and sprinted past the cells. His task there was finished, and he rushed to rejoin the hunt farther inside. Yuru reached the bottom passage with his men and ordered someone to bring light. One of the soldiers lifted a wrapped torch to the wall and struck a spark against it. With the torch blazing, the armored squad moved down the narrow stairway. Yuru pushed toward the lower cells, the others close behind with their spears at the ready. The captain's face remained hard in the torchlight, his eyes cold and steady. He looked into the darkness ahead, already guessing the kind of work that had been done down there. Then in front of the squad, the bald dude from a moment ago came into view, slumped against the wall with the arrow still lodged in his chest. Without pausing, he scans the area past the dead body. His aim settled on a chained elf woman in a torn white dress, her arms stretched high above her head. She looked half-conscious. Her face glistened with sweat, and her breathing was rough but steady. The captain stepped in front of her and waved for his men to hold their spears back. Looking her over, he let out a low grunt and joked that a girl this pretty could make a man lose his senses. The elf woman remained hanging with her head bowed, her pale skin almost glowing against the rough stone. Her long hair spilled forward, hiding most of her face, but the faint shimmer in her eyes showed that she was still awake. Then the Yuru's eyes widened and the color drained from his face. A drop of sweat slid down his cheek as he stared at her, his mind racing over what her appearance might mean. In the torchlight, her skin looked as white as carved jade, and her long ears rose sharply through her hair. She hung there in chains, dressed in torn white cloth, too weak to stand, yet still carrying a strange and distant grace. Yuru and his soldiers suddenly dropped to their knees and pressed their heads to the cold stone, as if they had encountered the holy goddess. Deep in the dungeon, a lone prisoner clung to the bars and tried to shout for help, but his voice barely carried through the cold stone hall. Inside the chamber, the brute grabbed a fistful of the elf woman's hair and yanked her head up without the slightest care. Her head tilted back under his grip, sweat running down her face. The bald man leaned in until his breath brushed her cheek, tossing out smug words while she hung there silent and unreadable. Then a sharp whistle sliced through the air, and the bald man dropped with an arrow buried in his back, leaving the elf staring as her tormentor fell without warning. She muttered to herself that her savior had finally come to her rescue. Then she noticed Yuru, a tall dwarf and human. Yuru continues to observe the elf. He recognized the pale skin and pointy ear, indicating that the person in front of him is someone special. A celestial maiden. The elf's mind raced, unable to understand why Yuru and his team are bowing to her. Above the dungeon, the grand castle had become a war zone, its front yard littered with fallen men as shouts and clashing steel tore through the night. The black-armored ghost cavalry drove their spears straight through the defenders, finishing them off for good. Outside the hall, the castle guards knelt in a row with their spears planted in the ground. In front of them, the heavy riders of Gogurieo stood tall and silent, making it unmistakably clear who ruled this place now. One of the kneeling knights lifted his head slightly, sweat sliding down his cheek as the truth of their defeat finally settled in. Ko Jinshin stood with his arms crossed, towering over the courtyard like a dark statue. The captured knight dared to look up at him, searching his face for even the faintest trace of mercy and finding none. Then one of the mounted Gogurieo riders guided his horse forward and stopped before the Ko Jinshin to deliver his report, while the rest of the unit waited in tight formation. The rider stated calmly that everyone connected to Alvin's family had already been taken down, and not a single member of that house was still alive. Hearing that, the captured knight stared in horror at the dark figure before him, and said that even common bandits would not usually go so far as to wipe out an entire noble family. His voice shook as he wondered what kind of force would cross that line. Then Ko Jinshin ordered his officer to gather the fallen, and the man answered at once, already moving to carry out the command. A moment later, Ko Jinshin's eyes narrowed beneath his horned helm as he caught something in the distance that instantly put him on alert. He turned his mount toward the thunder of hooves and spotted an old man Rigel racing across the street with riders at his back, shouting for the general as if the world itself were burning. The elder mage swung down from his horse and hurried across the stone, stopping before the towering general while the rest of the riders pulled up around them. Ko Jinshin asked why he had come charging in before any signal had even been sent. Still out of breath, the elder blurted out that they had to stop the mage responsible for long-distance communication. He hurriedly explained that this world's communication magic worked like an instant signal fire, sending news straight from here to the capital the moment it was cast. He said there was no time for a full explanation, but if they pressed Baron Alvin's household or his close retainers for names like Lissel and Anya, they could identify whoever handled that magic. Then his gaze fell to the brutal trophies in the soldiers' hands, and a raw scream tore out of him. He pointed at them as he stammered that every last member of Alvin's family and close circle had already been dealt with, not a single one left alive to question. Ko Jinshin gave only a short nod at the report, as if the slaughter had been expected all along. Beside him, the old mage stared at the trophies in horror, sweat pouring down his face. Then the general's eyes shifted toward the palace doors as a shout reached him, his focus snapping away from the dead baron's affairs. Yuru burst through the palace doors with an elf slung over his back, yelling for his commander while the other soldiers pounded down the steps behind him. Yuru charged straight toward Ko Jinshin with the pale, long-eared woman hanging weakly over his back, her bare feet dragging behind him. Stopping before them, Yuru straightened as much as he could under her weight, and proudly announced that he had rescued a celestial maiden from the dungeon. Ko Jinshin studied the woman's long ears and pale skin, then asked why Yuru was calling an elf a celestial maiden. The mage frowned deeply, clearly thrown by the sight of such a being in this place. The elf's eyes fluttered open, and she whispered that he was mistaken, that she was no celestial maiden at all. Yuru stiffened, and the pride on his face twisted into confusion. The mage leaned closer to Ko Jinshin and muttered that the woman on Yuru's back was not human at all, but something far rarer. Ko Jinshin began to consider how this strange captive might change their plans. Then the old mage suddenly told Ko Jinshin to wait, his eyes snapping upward. A heartbeat later, his face twisted in shock, as though he had just realized that a disaster was about to begin. Above the palace, a lone figure in the tower drew in purple energy until it wrapped around the entire spire. The mage muttered that Kai energy is beginning to gather. Then he dropped to his knees, his hands flailing as he shouted in alarm. Pure fear spread across his face, the kind of fear that said he knew exactly what sort of spell was being cast above them. Ko Jinshin glanced toward the tower and asked what all the fuss was about, saying that his soldiers could handle whatever it was. Still sweating, the mage could only stare at him, knowing this was far beyond a simple fight. He hurriedly explained that this was communication magic, a kind of signal fire that could send news straight from here to the capital. If that light finished forming, every power behind this palace would know exactly what had happened. Up in the tower, the caster raised a dark orb while the purple vortex roared around him, the magic already locked into place. Ko Jinshin watched in silence as the mage admitted that, with so much mana already gathered, it was too late to stop the message. Ko Jinshin shifted his gaze from the tower to Yuru and called his name. Yuru straightened at once with the elf still on his back, ready to carry out whatever order came next. Yuru carefully eased the elf from his shoulders and knelt before her, giving her room to sit upright on the cold stone. She blinked at him and at the chaos around them in confusion, still trying to understand why these strangers had pulled her out of the dungeon. At the same time, Yuru locked his grip on the bow, thick muscles tightening as he drew the string back for a serious shot. Yuru aimed high toward the distant tower, pulling until the bow itself creaked. Behind the drawn bow, the old mage stared upward and muttered that a shot like that should have been impossible from this distance. High above, the caster's purple magic wrapped the tower like a storm, the signal nearly complete and far beyond what any ordinary arrow should have been able to touch. Then Yuru released the arrow with so much energy toward the distant tower. Suddenly, a ring of force burst around the tower, and the caster's body was hurled from the balcony as the spell shattered in midair. Yuru slowly lowered his bow while the old mage and the freed elf all stared upward, following the fading streaks in the sky as they realized the target had been hit. The old mage felt the gathered mana snuff out in an instant and could only gasp that the power had vanished. And the elf woman, a high elf who took pride in both her sight and her magic, realized that even she had never seen an arrow move like that. Later, outside the grand hall, soldiers moved among the fallen, dragging crates and barrels toward waiting wagons as if this were just another job. The whole front yard of the palace looked less like a battlefield now, and more like a market being stripped bare. Yuru barked at the men to move faster as they hauled box after box from the wagons. Inside the hall, Yuru strode straight toward a soldier clutching a wooden box packed with glass tubes and tools, demanding to know what he was carrying around. The nearby guard stiffened, unsure whether they had just picked up something they were not supposed to touch. Yuru frowned at the box and asked whether strange things like that could even be sold for coin. Then a drawn-out wail rolled through the hall from behind the closed doors, sharp enough to cut through all the clatter. Without wasting another breath, Yuru slammed the doors open and charged inside, with a startled soldier hurrying after him. In the cluttered study, the old mage was already on his feet, clutching his head and howling over a shattered flask that leaked purple fumes across the rug. He raged that his precious mandra extract concentrate was gone, spitting out that hardly anyone alive could even guess what it had been worth. Yuru bluntly asked what this mandra thing even was, clearly failing to grasp its value. The mage hunched over the steaming mess, his hands shaking as he muttered that they were hopeless fools for treating his life's work like some random trinket. Then the old mage suddenly roared and ordered everyone to clear out at once. Yuru stared up at him, stunned by how quickly the frail old man had turned fierce. Still fuming, the mage shoved the warrior and the nearby soldiers toward the hall, barking that he would handle this place himself. Moments later, the warrior and his men stood posted in front of the shut doors, while the mage's muffled howls leaked through the wood. Inside, curled over the ruined rug, the mage clawed at the floor and let out another raw scream, the purple fumes still curling around him. Down in the grand hall, a soldier reported to Yuru that they had dragged out every valuable item they could find. Crates were stacked high around them, turning the marble floor into a cluttered warehouse. Yuru nodded, then let his gaze drift toward a shadowed corridor, where rows of gleaming suits of armor stood on display. He jabbed a finger toward the lined-up suits and ordered the soldier to haul every last one of them out. The confused man asked what use old display armor would be, clearly not seeing the idea yet. Then he guessed that they could just melt it down for arrows since they were already short on iron. Yuru's eyes lit up at that, suddenly pleased that even the palace decorations could be fed into their war machine. The officer then relayed Yuru's order, telling the archers that every piece of armor there was now nothing more than scrap metal. Ko Jin-chin watched the bustle in silence, fingers resting against his chin as he thought. Even with all this effort, he knew moving such a mountain of goods would not be easy. Looking over the stacked sacks and crates, Yuru admitted that their carts would never be enough to carry all of it. Ko Jin-chin told one of his officers to take 40 men and hand out the extra grain in the streets, with orders to seek out the poorest faces first. The officer bowed, already imagining the hungry crowds that would swarm them. The general then pointed at the fallen plate armor and told the officer to have every suit hammered flat before it was loaded onto the wagons. Moments later, Goguryeo soldiers knelt over the fallen suits and brought their hammers down again and again, punching dents through the fine plates. In only a few blows, noble armor that had once displayed status became nothing but twisted scrap. Nearby palace soldiers watched with wide eyes as the Goguryeo troopers kept hammering, each strike chewing through armor that could have paid for a decade of comfort. In that moment, they understood that to these invaders, the treasures of their kingdom were nothing more than raw material for war. The armor lay piled in a heap of bent plates and broken joints, with no trace of its former shine left. It was ready to be shoveled up and melted down into something that would serve Goguryeo instead. Two Goguryeo soldiers knelt over the ruined plates, grinning as their hammers rang out. One of them joked that they were breaking the pieces apart nicely and urged the others to keep going. Not far from the workers, the grass suddenly swelled and trembled as if something beneath it were forcing its way upward. Then a metal-gloved hand punched through the soil, flinging dirt aside as someone dragged himself out of the ground. A hooded man in light armor hauled the rest of his body from the hole, mud sliding off his cloak as he steadied himself on the lawn. He was clearly pleased that his sneaky entrance had finally paid off. Then he pulled back his hood, revealing pale hair and a crooked grin that said he was enjoying every second of this break-in. A nearby Goguryeo soldier stopped hammering and turned with a frown toward the sound in the garden, while Ko Jin-chin watched in cold silence. Out on the lawn, the white-haired man stood tall. As he raised his blade, laughing, he called himself Gerard of the Lightning, and demanded that someone step forward to face him. But Gerard's smug look quickly began to fade when he noticed movement near the walls, wondering why no one seemed impressed by his little performance. Ko Jin-chin stepped forward and coldly ordered them to bring the noisy intruder down. Gerard dragged a hand over his face and grumbled that even top mercenaries lowered their heads at the sound of his name. Yet these armored strangers dared to brush him off. With one sharp motion, he drew his blade, ready to let his sword speak for him. Standing straight with his sword pointed toward the sky, Gerard boasted that he was the continent's greatest treasure hunter and one of the 10 master swordsmen, acting as though the arrows thudding into the grass around him meant nothing. Then he felt a sting on his cheek and froze, stunned that these disciplined archers had actually managed to mark him. Across the yard, a line of Goguryeo archers drew their bows in perfect sync, already lining up the next shot as if they were on a training field. From above, Gerard looked small on the open lawn, hemmed in by arrows buried in the dirt, while two full ranks of archers aimed down at him from the terrace, turning his flashy entrance into a deadly standoff. Gerard slowly raised both hands with a bright, forced smile, blood still running down his cheek, and calmly announced that he surrendered. They dragged the treasure hunter into the garden, bound him tight, and surrounded him with blades and drawn bows as if they expected him to bolt the instant they looked away. Kneeling there with blood running down his cheek, the treasure hunter glared up at them as he sized up the people who had caught him. Nearby, a Goguryeo soldier stomped through a heap of armored, and the sight made the treasure hunter's eyes widen, as he finally understood just how completely insane these people are. Then the Ko Jin-chin stepped out from the doorway with his arms crossed and calmly ordered his men to hold back. As the Ko Jin-chin turned away, Yuru called after him and said there was nothing to worry about. Grinning with a hammer in hand, Yuru stood before a mountain of stripped armor, bragging that the soldiers had only arrived late because he had already taken care of everything himself. Ko Jin-chin's face remained calm as he listened, his eyes barely shifting while he judged his Yuru's work. Bound and slumped in place, the treasure hunter sank deeper into gloom, already grieving the hard-earned coin this job had cost him. He stared out over the city with drying blood on his cheek and thought about how he normally made his living diving into dungeons, only to end up scraping by on small jobs whenever war broke out. He thinks to himself and jokes that, for a swordmaster like him, slipping away from a place like this would be simple. But behind his smile, his thoughts sharpened. He admitted to himself that the real reason he had surrendered so quickly was his own bad habit as a treasure hunter, that nagging curiosity he could never quite shake. He wanted to stay close and dig into the truth behind these strange warriors. That plan, however, ended the moment the armored commander struck him without warning and sent him crashing to the ground. Stumbling forward with ropes biting across his chest, the treasure hunter barked at the general and demanded to know why he had been hit, and why they were treating him like some loose-tongued child. The general glanced back and coolly told him that from now on, details like being a swordmaster needed to come first, not as some casual afterthought. The bound man leaned forward and shouted after the armored leader, demanding to know why he should have to reveal everything about himself just because they asked. But after that outburst, he steadied himself and chose to endure the ropes a little longer, at least until his questions were answered. Then a faint grin tugged at his mouth as he realized he had already uncovered one important clue about these people. Shuffling along behind the armored commander, still wrapped in rope, the treasure hunter finally understood that this man did not let even the smallest slight pass. Nearby, Rigel nodded slowly and said that choosing to seize equipment instead of coin had been the right move, because what they truly needed now was raw material and iron. Ko Jin-chin stood beneath the dim sky in silence, letting the old man's words about supplies and metal settle in. Beside carts piled high with looted armor, the elder explained that in times of war, coin meant very little when the state was sweeping up every scrap of iron it could find to send to the empire. Because of that, melting everything down was the smarter choice. The wagons were already packed with broken breastplates and crushed helmets, and Rigel pointed out that reforging all of it into sturdy dwarven armor would bring them far more value than any chest of coin ever could. Ko Jin-chin brushed his chin and quietly agreed, accepting that turning iron into armor was the wiser path. Then he lifted his gaze to the brightening clouds and remarked that dawn was almost upon them. With that, he gathered his troops, and the long line of wagons and soldiers rolled away from the captured mansion, heading back as the sun climbed over the rooftops. The town woke to a calm morning, with sunlight slipping between crooked roofs and laundry lines. Down in one alley, a lone worker moved about, still thinking it would be just another quiet day. Then a burly shopkeeper stepped out through his doorway and froze when he spotted 2 full sacks resting at his feet. They looked heavy with food, and he had no idea who could have left them there. His eyes widened as he realized the bags were packed with bread and grain, more than he could ever have afforded on his own. He blurted out in confusion and demanded to know who had dropped such a gift at his door, before he could make sense of it. A younger townsman came sprinting down the street toward him, clearly out of breath. The runner shouted that something terrible had happened. Grabbing the shopkeeper's attention, he blurted out that Baron Alvin's mansion had been destroyed, smashed apart, and filled with bodies. The word struck the quiet street like a hammer. The shopkeeper stared at him in shock, then managed to force out a shaky question about who could have done such a thing. The runner could only say that nobody knew yet, and somehow that made it worse. The younger man frowned and admitted that part of him was glad the wretched Baron was finally gone. Even so, he muttered that in this world, someone just as terrible would probably take that empty seat before long. The 2 men fell silent, the weight of the news hanging between them while the untouched sacks of food sat at their feet. For the moment, all they could do was wonder what kind of power had swept through their town overnight. Then the shopkeeper's gaze softened as he realized those sacks meant his family would eat, even if the cost behind them felt hard to accept. The younger man pointed out that thanks to whoever had done this, the town finally had enough grain to make it through the winter. The shopkeeper nodded slowly, still uneasy, but unable to deny that staying alive mattered more than his doubts. All across the town, doorsteps were lined with swollen sacks of grain, each one a silent promise that no child would go hungry. People whispered their thanks to the unseen hand that had turned a night of terror into something that almost felt like a blessing. The shopkeeper let out a small, honest smile, grateful to whoever had saved his family from hunger. And far away, General Ko Jin-chin rode on in black armor, the corner of his mouth lifting ever so slightly, satisfied that his raid had already begun to win hearts. The black-armored ghost cavalry drove their wagons hard through the mountain pass, iron hooves shaking the ground. One cart bounced over a hidden rock, its wheels shuddering as the entire load lurched dangerously to one side. Inside the rattling cage, the blonde prisoner was thrown against the bars and shouted for the driver to knock it off. But the wagons kept rolling between walls of armored riders, their tight formation making it clear that his complaints meant nothing out here. The blonde panted against the bars, feeling every jolt grind through his bones and thinking that this ride was its own kind of torture. In the front, the wagon clattered over loose stone while the Gogurieo soldiers marched alongside it, more concerned with the cargo than the man locked inside. Now the wagon wheel, patched together from weak local wood, splintered under the strain, proving the prisoner right and promising real trouble for the convoy if it gave out completely. One of the officers snapped at his man to report the wagon trouble to the general, and the younger soldier rushed off to obey, knowing the matter had already climbed far above his station. From behind the bars, the blonde captive watched the riders split apart while one soldier crouched by the damaged wheel, working on it as if it were just another chore on a long march. The prisoner frowned as it finally sank in that they were dragging him toward the Raganza Mountains, a place even hardened veterans called dangerous and tried to avoid. His eyes swept over the cavalrymen wrapped in scale mail from neck to ankle, with even their horses buried beneath the same iron plates, and he realized this unit had been built to crush anything in its path. When he focused on the officer's presence, the mana around the man felt twisted and foreign, so strange that even a swordmaster like him could not judge how strong this warrior really was. Thinking back on his earlier stunt, the swordmaster had to admit that if he had misread these people by even a little, there would have been no escape for him at all. Bound and sitting still, he let the tightness in his chest ease as he weighed his odds again now that the first rush of fear had passed. Then a small smile tugged at his lips as he decided he had been overthinking it, and the old, easy confidence of a seasoned treasure hunter settled back into place. The blonde swordmaster pushed himself upright inside the cage, rope biting into his waist as he leaned toward the bars, his eyes sharp now that he had chosen his moment. A nearby guard barked at him to stay back, but the captive only dipped his head and stepped closer, his hand flashing toward the bars as though he had just found the opening he needed. His lashes lowered, and a thin smile curled across his lips like a hunter who had finally spotted the trapdoor swing open. Then a burst of force ripped the wagon apart and hurled the captive into the sky, wood and iron raining down as the guard stumbled back and the prisoner twisted in midair, turning that violent launch into a controlled fall. One of the soldiers screamed that the prisoner was loose, and in an instant the men spread out, some charging after him while the archers planted their feet and drew on his fleeing back. The blonde prisoner only grinned wider as the arrows hissed past, his body blurring into streaks of motion while their shots tore into empty ground behind him. He slammed into a guard hard enough to send the man tumbling, then used that same burst of speed to spring onto a supply cart, his boots skidding across barrels as his hand closed around a glowing band at a fallen man's waist. The treasure hunter straightened with the bright band humming around his wrist, flexing his fingers as he admired it, clearly pleased that the real game was finally about to begin. The officer barked for his men to calm the other prisoners, dismount, and bring the runaway down. Hearing that, the treasure hunter's lips curved into a sharper grin, as though that single order was exactly what he had been waiting for. The officer shouted for the troops to box the fugitive in tight so he could not reach anything sharp, while one nervous soldier wondered how they were supposed to pull that off. They were trying to turn the entire camp into a cage around one man. Meanwhile, the treasure hunter slipped a hand into the pile of goods and closed it around a hilt, drawing out a weapon before anyone noticed what he was doing. He rose on top of the wagon with a long blade in his grip, and cheerfully pointed out that he already had all the steel he needed. The guard stared wide-eyed at the massive sword in his hand, baffled by how something that large had come out of such a small pouch, and suddenly understood just how badly the odds had shifted. The treasure hunter hopped lightly down from the wagon with the sword raised above his head, his whole stance declaring that the warm-up was over. Then he planted his feet on solid ground, leveled the blade at the ring of soldiers, and calmly announced that it was time for him to walk out of this place. The treasure hunter squared himself in front of the wagons with his sword in hand, while the armored soldiers closed in, shields raised and spears leveled. Treating him like a real threat now, without waiting for them to make the first move, he burst forward between the wagons, cloak snapping behind him as he rushed straight at the officer. But when his opening strike failed to break through, he frowned in disbelief, shocked that men weighed down in heavy-scale mail could move fast enough to block him that cleanly. From where he stands, the officer kept his blade low and his eyes sharp, choosing to hold back for the moment and see whether his scale-clad soldiers could handle one nimble grave robber on their own. Steel crashed down from three sides as the soldiers attacked in unison. Yet the treasure hunter dropped low instead of challenging their strength head-on, sliding beneath their blades with almost lazy grace. He twisted through the gap, letting the heavy swords whistle past his chest before spinning out of reach, boots skidding across the dirt as the soldiers hurried to turn and close the distance again. He planted his feet and glared, teeth clenched as he cursed under his breath that even the regular soldiers were keeping up with him when this was supposed to be an easy escape. In front of him, the two nearest soldiers stepped forward in the same steady rhythm, blades rising together, their calm eyes making it clear they had no doubt this runaway would be brought down. The grave robber glanced at the line of scale-clad soldiers and the armored rider behind them, and a bead of sweat slid down his cheek as it dawned on him that if there were more men built like this, slipping away would be nearly impossible. He stood alone in the open with the tip of his sword resting against the ground and quietly admitted to himself that breaking through this net was going to be rough. Still, his fingers tightened around the hilt, knuckles whitening as he forced the thought of surrender out of his head. A crooked grin spread across his face as he reminded himself that backing down had never been who he was, and if escaping was hard, then he would simply carve his way through. He kicked off the ground and hurled himself at the soldiers, sword raised high as he poured everything into one reckless strike. The blade slammed into the front soldier's sword in a burst of sparks. The others stepped in at once, their swords pinning his attack in place instead of letting him break through. Steel flashed again and again as the grave robber twisted between three blades beside the wagons. From his saddle, Ko Jinshin watched closely, taking note of how this so-called thief was still matching trained soldiers blow for blow. Ko Jinshin's eyes narrowed with interest, and he quietly judged that this grave robber was more than a nuisance and might actually be useful. Ko Jinshin watched the clash without blinking, and calmly decided that the thief's sword work was solid and balanced. Even with blades closing in from every direction, the grave robber kept driving forward without the slightest hesitation, proving that his nerve mattered more than flashy technique. Ko Jinshin could already tell the man had sensed that escape was nearly impossible, yet his sword had not wavered once. Ko Jinshin also knew the stalemate would only drag on while his ghost cavalry remained tied down and wasted time. Yuru glanced over and suggested that they send in one of their better swordsmen to finish it. Ko Jinshin agreed and calmly asked which swordsman they had on hand for something like this. Yuru said that the smooth-talking swordsman was the best option, and the so-called liar cleared his throat with a smug grin, already acting as though he had been chosen. Ko Jinshin looked toward Yuru and dryly asked whether that praise for the so-called liar was even meant honestly. Down by the wagons, the grinning swordsman tapped his cheek and shared a laugh with the others as if he had just landed a joke. From the saddle, Ko Jinshin heard the chatter rising near the wagons and turned his head, demanding to know what kind of noise they were making back there. Rigel hurriedly reported that the commotion was coming from a grave robber they had caught at the castle, and that he was now trying to break free. As he watched, the Rigel narrowed his eyes, feeling certain that he had seen the grave robber's face before. Down by the wagons, that same man drove into 3 soldiers at once, his blade moving fast enough to keep their spears and swords from closing in around him. The grave robber spun and hacked toward another guard, only for a black-armored warrior to slide in front of him and catch the strike on his own blade without giving up even an inch. Thrown off balance, the grave robber planted his hands flipped over the soldiers, then whipped into a tight spin, his cloak and sword carving a swirling ring that forced the men around him to fall back. Studying the way the soldiers moved together, he admitted to himself that their teamwork had been forged through countless battles, and that if this turned into a drawn-out fight, it would only wear him down. So he chose to gamble everything on one decisive move. Blue lightning raced up his arm and along his blade as he poured his full strength into it, the air around him buzzing under the sudden surge of power while crackling arcs snapped from the sword. The grave robber rushed straight at the black-armored warrior, throwing all of his fear and anger into a single strike and daring them to block this one. But when his lightning-filled blade slammed into the warrior's sword and stopped dead, his eyes widened in shock. The man had brushed it aside without even using sword aura, revealing a gap in skill far wider than he had expected. Realizing that, the grave robber stopped holding back completely, flooding his sword with even more lightning as he charged again, prepared to spend everything on this one rush. Rigel stared at the blazing pillar of lightning ripping through the line and felt a jolt of fear as he finally realized that the grave robber was actually Gerard of the Lightning. Ko Jinshin calmly asked whether he knew anything about this lightning-wielding swordsman. Rigel shouted that Gerard of the Lightning was one of the 10 great swordsmen of the continent, and the only true swordmaster among the unbound free knights, a man far beyond ordinary knights. Gerard crashed into the Goguryeo warriors with all that lightning, fighting left and right with no problem, and even managed to almost kill one of the soldier. But suddenly he got smashed aside by the counter, his body thrown past the wagon in a burst of dust and light. As the nearby soldiers struggled back to their feet, their leader ordered them to fall back, and calmly declared that he would face Gerard himself. Gerard remembered how easily the man had stopped his longsword, and had to admit to himself that this warrior was much stronger than he had first believed. Then Mr. Conman formally invited Gerard to a real match. Gerard planted his feet, started to raise his sword again. The air shook as he poured every last bit of himself into that single blade, ready to clash with Jai Ungsam one more time. The lightning-wrapped sword ripped across the ground toward the Goguryeo line, bright enough to drown out the forest itself. The soldiers tensed, but their dark-haired leader merely watched it come, unreadable. Gerard glared at that calm expression and felt his pride flare, convinced the man was mocking his lightning. He gritted his teeth and forced even more power into the crackling aura around him. Jai Ungsam studied the crackling blade and quietly noted that this was just a sword kai. He gave a faint, amused smile, brushed off the grand title of sword aura, and said that he would simply cut through it. Gerard stared back, stunned that this man could remain so relaxed in front of his strongest move, and demanded to know what kind of monster he was dealing with. Then Gerard surged forward, cloak snapping behind him while the lightning around his blade stretched. He aimed straight for Jai Ungsam, determined to answer his own doubt with one clean strike. He dropped a hand to the ground to keep from tumbling, twisted his body, and dragged the lightning blade through a wide, screaming arc. The swing hurled out a wall of blue light that ripped apart the earth in front of him. The instant Gerard's charge met Jai Ungsam, a pillar of light tore into the sky and shredded the ground around them. Gerard was thrown back toward the wagon, boots skidding, but he forced himself upright with his sword still clenched in hand, sparks of lightning stubbornly crawling across the steel. Jai Ungsam simply stood there in the thinning dust, sword hanging at his side and a faint smile on his face, as though that enormous blast had been nothing more than a warm-up. Gerard clenched his bruised teeth, cold sweat running down his cheek as it finally hit him that his strongest strike had barely made the other man move at all. Then Jai Ungsam slowly turned his back and looked past Gerard as though the fight were already finished and there were more important matters waiting. Gerard shouted after him, furious that this stranger would turn his back after only one clash, while the Goguryeo soldiers stepped forward with leveled blades to stop the proud knight from making another move. The Goguryeo swordsman rolled his shoulders, and his hand closed around the hilt with quiet strength, a clear sign that the playing around was over. Gerard barely had time to tense before Jai Ungsam kicked off the ground. Jai Ungsam's fingers locked around the hilt, his grip turning iron hard as he poured his strength into the blade. A wild spiral of wind ripped across the ground between them, and Gerard suddenly felt the mana in the air twist in a way he had never experienced before. His eyes narrowed as a cold bead of sweat slid down his cheek, The mana around them was no longer moving at his command. Even so, he yanked at the broken flow, forcing raw mana back into his blade until blue lightning crashed down over him and split the ground at his feet. Gerard kicked off the shattered earth and shot forward, his lightning sword dragging a bright trail that flashed up into the night sky and washed the distant forest in blue light. High above the trees, that streak of light cut across a sky that suddenly felt too still, as if the very air were holding its breath. Jai Ungsam slid 1 foot back and settled into a steady stance, while the forest around him fell into a strange silence. On the other side, Gerard tightened his grip as it hit him that even the air itself had gone still. Then Jai Ungsam drove forward, armor plates flashing as he cut through the frozen air. In an instant, Jai Ungsam sweeping in right behind Gerard. Gerard braced himself as a sharp gust wrapped around his cloak, while Jai Ungsam finished his move. In a very fast motion, even Gerard can't help but wonder how this is possible. The strike lands on Gerard's sword while charging up the aura. But in that instant, he finally understood that even the wind was no longer on his side. Suddenly, a supposedly aura-strengthening sword that only a few people in this continent can use has been destroyed. The strike tore through the woods, ripping trees from the earth and showering the wagon and horses with flying logs and dust. From high above, the path of the blow looked like a scar carved straight through the forest, with dust and broken trunks hanging in the air. But Jai Ungsam walked through the drifting dust with steady steps, his gaze locked on Gerard as if the ruined forest meant nothing at all. The wagon sat wrecked between them, smoke curling from its wheels, as Gerard raised his sword, and Jai Ungsam closed in from the other side. Gerard glanced back with a twisted grin, a bead of sweat sliding down his cheek as he laughed much louder than the moment called for. Jai Ungsam simply stood there in the thinning dust, sword hanging at his side, his quiet stare cutting deeper than any words. Gerard raised his sword with a crooked smile and admitted that the other man's blade had earned his full respect. Jai Ungsam let out a soft breath and nodded, calmly returning the praise as though they were exchanging respect on a training ground instead of an erect forest. Gerard and Jai Ungsam held each other's gaze, a quiet thrill passing between them, like they had finally found someone worth crossing blades with. Then Gerard turned with an easy step and called back that they should do this again, already acting as if this brutal clash had only been the warm-up. As the Goguryeo soldiers closed in around him, Gerard frowned at his sword and gear, muttering about how much this little test had just cost him. He walked over to the wagon piled with shattered armor and tossed his sword into it like he was throwing away a bill he did not want to pay. Then he hauled himself up onto the empty cage wagon and shouted for them to get moving, acting like the wrecked forest and broken steel were already yesterday's problem. Once the wagon began to roll, Gerard sprawled across the wooden floor with his hands behind his head, already settling in for a nap as if the battle had been nothing more than a fun workout. An officer barked at the men to stop dawdling, pushing them to finish loading the wagons. Around him, the Goguryeo soldiers snapped into motion, eager to get the strange prisoner convoy back on the road. Ko Jin-chin narrowed his eyes and told a nearby soldier to bring that white-haired captive over to him at once. The wagons picked up speed, and Gerard had to sprint just to keep pace, ropes biting into his wrists. Sweat poured down his face as he ground his teeth, refusing to stumble in front of these ironclad strangers. Away from the road, 3 Goguryeo soldiers knelt in a tight circle, marking the dirt as if they were laying out some careful design. The 3 men traded eager smiles and raised their tools, ready to drive their strange pattern into the earth. One soldier slammed his blade straight into the ground, the impact kicking up dirt as the first point of their pattern locked into place. Then all of them went to work at once, stabbing their blades into the dirt again and again until the clearing was dotted with fresh marks and loose soil. When they finally slowed, the men stayed crouched over their work, while the quiet forest around them hid a trap that only the Goguryeo would understand. One of the younger soldiers leaned over the pit, his eyes shining as he realized their secret brew was finally ready. The 3 soldiers grinned at one another and pumped their fists, thrilled that their buried jar had finished fermenting at last. One of them steadied the heavy jar and grabbed the tight cloth lid, ready to peel it back and taste what they had made. Working together, the soldiers heaved the jar up out of the shallow pit, dirt crumbling away as their hidden stash finally met open air. Then from the darkness of the hole, the bulky shape of an armored figure rose up, and the soldiers froze as they realized who they had just disturbed. They dropped to their knees in front of General Buru, pressing their hands together and rushing to explain that the jar held only a trial drink made from leftover grain, begging him to believe they had meant it as an offering for him. One soldier pressed his forehead into the dirt, his whole body shaking as cold sweat ran down his face while he waited for the general's judgment. After a tense pause, he slowly raised his head just enough to peek forward, bracing himself for whatever verdict was coming. But instead of General Buru, a huge red-bearded dwarf loomed over the kneeling soldier, axe in hand and eyes narrowed, making the poor man's heart nearly stop all over again. The red-bearded dwarf grabbed the bottle, poured the cloudy liquor into a bowl, and knocked it back in one long gulp. A wave of heat hit him at once, and he roared with delight as he and his companion kept drinking, amazed that the liquor had aged into something this strong. Before long, the dwarves and the Goguryeo soldiers were all gathered around the jar, sipping from their bowls. All the red-bearded dwarf praised the cloudy drink, saying the makjiali was thick like soup, yet went down smoother than anything he knew. One of the younger soldiers chuckled into his sleeve and admitted that they had nearly wet themselves earlier when that bulky shape rose from the hole, because they were sure it was General Buru catching them. The red-bearded dwarf burst out laughing and said he had only followed their careful movements in the dark, convinced he was tracking some enemy scout instead of a bunch of nervous drinkers. With the tension finally broken, one of the soldiers leaned toward his friend and wondered out loud what liquor in this world usually tasted like, eager to find out how their rough macchiali compared. The dwarf lifted his bowl again, took a long, easy sip, and nodded with a pleased grin, saying that the strange human brew was good in its own way too. Then he smacked his lips and told the other dwarves that, just as expected, their own liquor still set the standard, even if this new brew was impressive. The red-bearded dwarf threw his head back and roared that nothing in the world could beat beer, and his comrades howled right along with him. The young soldiers traded puzzled looks, and one of them finally asked what this so-called beer was supposed to be. The dwarves nodded and began telling them about another drink called beer, grinning as they remembered the sharp, fizzy bite that came with every gulp. One of the soldiers hugged his bowl and laughed that now he really wanted to try this beer for himself someday. The red-bearded dwarf watched them stumble over their words and caught the feeling that these humans might already know more about beer than they were letting on. Merwin, the red-bearded dwarf of the Earth tribe, listened as his comrade pointed out that since the humans had shared their macchiali, it was only fair for the dwarves to return the favor. Later, at a small house the dwarves used as a brewery, the soldiers raised heavy wooden mugs and gulped down the foaming beer like men who had just found water in the middle of a desert. One soldier wiped the foam from his mouth, stared at his empty mug, and burst out that he could not believe this incredible sharp-tasting drink was what the dwarves called beer. As the mugs emptied, one of the younger soldiers leaned forward, praising the dwarf for making something this good, then asked what grain he had used to brew it. The red-bearded dwarf chuckled into his mug and answered without the slightest concern, saying the beer was made from barley. The soldier's eyes widened at the word barley, and he carefully asked where the dwarf had even gotten hold of such a precious grain. The red-bearded dwarf started to mention the warehouse, but his comrades lunged at once, grabbing his face and loudly joking that their friend was just drunk, trying to laugh the question away before it went any further. As they kept drinking, the soldiers slowly lowered their mugs, and the truth began to settle over them. The missing barley from their meals had all been turned into this beer, and a heavy chill ran down their backs. The three of them burst into a panic, hissing that they would all be finished if anyone found out, because using full barley like this was on a completely different level from sneaking a little rice to make grain wine. The red-bearded dwarf stared them down, proudly declaring that the Earth tribe could handle anything and had nothing to fear. He spread his arms over the table, saying he would take responsibility for whatever happened, and urging the nervous soldiers to forget the rules for once and just enjoy the beer. But the three soldiers sat there stiff as boards, their mugs forgotten, cold sweat rolling down their faces as the full weight of what they had done finally hit them. The red-bearded dwarf lifted a finger and repeated a smug old dwarf saying their trick only counted as skill if nobody noticed, then let out a sigh and admitted that this time they had definitely been noticed. A heartbeat later, the workshop entrance exploded inward in a shower of splinters, cutting their little drinking party short. Their leader, Buru, ducked through the broken doorway and loomed over the table with one fist raised while the two dwarves shrank in their seats. Buru stared down at them with a hard grin and called the three troublemakers out by comparing them to dumb rocks. And before long, the dwarves and soldiers were lined up beneath his glare, frozen in place. Soon after that, the dwarves and soldiers found themselves standing out in a bare field beside a crooked watchtower under the open sky, while one dwarf was already struggling with a heavy plow. Nearby, Von the Blonde stood with his arms folded next to an old villager, both of them openly amused as they admitted they had never even heard of dwarves working fields, let alone seen it with their own eyes. Meanwhile, the dwarves kept grinding through their work without complaint. As Buru shouted down from the watchtower, ordering them to work harder, night wrapped around the forest as the Goguryeo camp glowed with small fires, their banners barely stirring in the still air. At the center, the command tent stood like a lone island of light, holding the real business of the night. Under the mountain's shadow, the soldiers warmed their hands over the cook fire, trading quiet looks instead of jokes. Everyone knew the calm of the night only lasted because their commanders were handling the real problem elsewhere. Inside the tent, the rescued elf sat with a calm smile, her long ears and pale skin almost glowing in the lamplight. Across from her, Kojin-chin, Yuru, and Rigel Old Mage studied her in silence, weighing what this strange guest might mean for their new land. Kojin-chin leaned forward with his arms folded and pressed the elf to explain why someone like her had been locked up in Baron Alvin's lands. He wanted to know who had dared to chain her and what kind of power was moving through this forest. Rigel introduced himself as the human mage, offering respect from one rare being to another. The elf lowered her head with a gentle smile and answered in kind, calling Rigel a shard of chaos and a child born from Manhwa itself. She thanked him on behalf of her high elf clan, making it clear that she did not see him as just another human mage. Rigel's eyes widened as her words sank in and he realized she was a true high elf. For a moment, the old mage, who had seen almost everything, could do nothing but stare, stunned by how rare and dangerous a guest now sat in their camp. As the four of them sat facing one another, the mage muttered that it made no sense for a high elf to be dragged through such misery, since in human terms she was closer to a sacred leader than an ordinary noble. The high elf explained that her clan moved between the other elf tribes, giving blessings to newborn children as part of an ancient promise. She recalled how, while passing through Baron Alvin's territory, human soldiers had seized her and fastened a strange mana restraint around her neck, a rare tool that cut off her power and left her unable to break free. Rigel frowned and said that even the gentlest elves would become a vengeful army if someone dared to harm a high elf, then wondered what Baron Alvin had been relying on to face that kind of fury. Ko Jin-chin gave a short nod, taking in what that meant and already folding it into his next move. Yuru scratched his cheek and awkwardly asked the old mage if he could borrow that ring for himself. Ko Jin-chin barked that the ring was a keepsake from the mage's own master, demanding to know how anyone could even think of borrowing something so important for personal use. Yuru shrank under the rebuke and muttered a quick apology, clearly wishing he could take the question back. Trying to defend himself, he mentioned that even the Grand Lion had spoken that way about the ring, only for the Rigel to cough in warning. As the Ko Jin-chin's eyes narrowed again, the high elf slipped down from her stool, her robe brushing the wood as she moved with calm purpose. She walked right up Yuru and stopped so close that he had to tilt his head back to look at her. Before he could react, her pale hands rose toward his face, leaving him confused by her sudden boldness. The elf cub pressed her forehead to his, whispering a flowing phrase in Elven that sounded like some kind of blessing. Light burst out where their foreheads met, washing over them in a shower of sparks as the war chief gripped the stool, stunned by the sudden rush of power. Rigel and Ko Jin-chin stared with wide eyes as the glow between elf and warrior grew brighter, realizing she was sharing something far beyond a simple thanks. Even the guards posted outside straightened as a sharp beam of light poured through the doorway, hinting that something strange was happening inside the tent. Inside, the high elf knelt before Yuru, gently holding his head as a steady band of rainbow light flowed between their brows like a bridge. With her eyes softly closed and his wide and searching, the elf kept their foreheads together as the glow softened, binding her calm spirit to the rough warrior in a way he had never felt before. Yuru stared ahead, eyes wide, as the last sparks of light faded around him and a strange new clarity settled over his mind. The high elf straightened her dress and bowed, calmly introducing herself as Hydia Bayfumir and honoring him as the descendant of a noble warrior. Yuru jolted to his feet, shouting in pure shock before breaking into wild laughter, and yelling that he could finally understand every word she said. Ko Jin-chin turned to the old mage with a frown and quietly asked what kind of power could make a foreign tongue suddenly make perfect sense. The mage explained that high elves like Hydia could blend another person's words with their own using divine power, a rare gift that worked almost like magic. Meanwhile, Yuru dropped to his knees in overwhelmed gratitude, bowing low beside her and pressing his head toward the floor. The rough warrior suddenly acting like a humble servant before the elf who had shared her power. Hydia met his gaze with a warm, almost shy smile, and the heavy air inside the tent eased as the warrior straightened, clearly seeing her now as an honored ally rather than a stranger. Their eyes stayed locked for a long moment, warrior and high elf studying each other in silence, both of them knowing that this strange power had just tied their fates together. Yuru feels like he is standing on the cliff, letting the harsh wind slam into him. As it roared past, he felt it carrying a wild force, as if the whole continent itself were beginning to move. Back in the tent, Yuru laughed loudly and proudly, thumping his chest as he asked whether that fierce wind she spoke of was meant to be him. Hydia smiled softly at the huge warrior and answered that he was indeed the one she had sensed in the wind. Then she knelt before Rigel while the war chief and his men watched, and the tent fell into a thoughtful hush as they all weighed what her words about him might really mean. Hydia and Rigel locked eyes, trading a silent look that spoke of old lessons about power, time, and the burden of true talent. In his mind, the mage saw himself floating before a tear in the sky as the voice inside urged him not to rush, promising that with time he would break through and reach true harmony. Back in the tent, the old man bowed his head, quietly grateful for the teachings that had carried him this far. Ko Jin-chin glanced down at the kneeling elf and asked what she was doing now. The mage calmly answered that one of Hydia's gifts was the power to look past the body and see a person's very essence. Ko Jin-chin's eyes narrowed with interest, and he leaned toward the elf, asking her to tell him what kind of essence she could feel when she looked at him. Hydia lifted her gaze to Ko Jin-chin, her eyes searching deeper than his face. As her power stirred, her vision narrowed until nothing else in the room seemed to exist. In the next breath, her spirit slipped free and drifted through a dark, endless space as she reached toward the core of the Ko Jin-chin's being. Then her lashes trembled and her spirit snapped back into her body. Her eyes slowly opened again, heavy with confusion at the strange emptiness she had just touched. The elf stared at Ko Jin-chin in shock and tried to explain that when she reached for his essence, there was nothing there for her to grasp. Ko Jin-chin listened in silence as she spoke of seeing only empty space inside him, his gaze steady, as if weighing whether that emptiness was a flaw or a hidden strength. Then Yuru burst out laughing and roared that this only proved their general's head was completely empty. The joke shattered the heavy mood, leaving Hydia startled while the old mage and Ko Jin-chin watched him with very different kinds of patience. A sharp hand strike came down on Yuru's head, cutting his laughter short, while the rest of the tent was reminded that their iron-willed general was still very much present. From across the room, Hydia watched the warlord's harsh but simple way of keeping order, trying to understand this Iron Man who could laugh with his men one moment and strike them the next. Then the High Elf slowly raised her hands and pressed them together, choosing respect rather than fear before this strange human general. With her head bowed and eyes closed, Hydia offered a quiet blessing, as if thanking the empty space inside Ko-Jinshin for sparing her and opening a path she had never seen before. Far away, the black-armored ghost cavalry thundered through a knife-thin pass, their lines stretched between sheer blue cliffs that could just as easily become their grave as their road to victory. At the head of the column, the lead rider leaned low over his saddle, armor rattling as he drove the horses faster, trusting both the plan and the narrow path ahead. Then his eyes snapped wide as something ahead broke the steady rhythm of hooves and dust. Twisting in his saddle, he barked for the whole line to ease up, forcing the roaring charge to bleed off speed before they crashed into whatever was waiting. A wall of green bodies filled the gorge, tusks and crude armor packed tight around a towering orc marked with red lines across his skin. This was Bukabal, son of Mukabal, leading a full horde that had come to turn the narrow pass into a killing ground. Yuru yanked his horse aside and called for the left wing to break off with him, turning the tight column into a flanking spear. Up ahead, Bukabal threw his head back and roared to his horde that the threat was human cavalry, not the weak villagers they were used to crushing. Then he bellowed for every orc to pack in tight, forcing the entire horde to crush together into a living wall of muscle and shields. As they shoved into place, Bukabal bragged that he was not like his father, Mukabal, and would not make the same mistake. In his mind, he replayed how his father had left a path open and then crammed the horde together right in front of enemy bowmen. The humans had turned that packed mass into a slaughterhouse with a single storm of arrows. Now the gorge was sealed from cliff to cliff with green bodies, leaving no gap for the riders to slip through. Seeing only a few human horses and not a single bowstring in sight, Bukabal grinned wide, convinced that this time the horde would crush them. Yuru studied the packed orc ranks and knew a simple charge would only slam into them and die there. Hydia pressed against his back and quietly pointed out that breaking a wall like that would normally take the main force or a brutal close fight, and she could not understand why the orcs were still rushing toward them so boldly. But instead of slowing, Yuru suddenly brought up a bow, trusting the fine horse beneath him. Hydia clung to him as he drew the string back, turning their charge into a moving firing line. All along the formation, the black-armored riders copied him, letting go of their reins and drawing bows as if the horses were only extensions of their own bodies. Watching that perfect rhythm, Hydia admitted to herself that even elves who prided themselves on harmony could not ride and shoot like this. In that instant, she finally connected these strange short bows to the way they had dealt with the mage at the castle. Then the riders loosed as one, and a pale blur of arrows screamed down the pass toward the orc wall. Unfortunately, Bukabal took the lead shot head-on, and the rest of the volley punched through the packed ranks behind him, shredding the very formation he had been so proud of. Pressed against Yuru's back, Hydia tried to follow the arrows and failed. Elven arrows rode the wind and answered the spirits. But these carried no trace of that power and still flew from racing horses even faster. She realized they were not merely quick. They were so fast they vanished from sight as they tore into the packed orc wall. Bukabal hit the ground while his own warriors crashed down around him, pierced and stumbling. Looking up through the rain of bodies, he finally understood that these humans could ride and shoot at the same time, something he had believed only existed in legend. The wall he had built to stop a charge had become a heap of falling orcs. From where he lay, Bukabal saw a flash tear through the center of the horde, hurling bodies into the air like broken dolls. As the light faded, that storm of orcs came crashing back down toward him. For a heartbeat, Bukabal's mind went blank. His face twisted somewhere between rage and disbelief as the noise of battle drained away from his thoughts. Then through the blur of falling bodies, he thought he saw a huge familiar figure waiting in the light, broad-chested with a fur cloak resting over massive shoulders, watching him without fear. The old war chief Mukabal raised a hand as if calling his child closer, a faint smile resting on his wide face. Bukabal's hard eyes finally softened as he answered that he was on his way to join his father. At last the packed horde gave way, and orcs slammed into one another from every side, piling into a churning mass that filled the orges from rock wall to rock wall. On the open path, the black-armored ghost cavalry lowered their lances and thundered forward, their tight line cutting through the scattered orcs who still tried to stand. Through that chaos, the black-armored riders kept advancing in perfect lines, hooves pounding as they stormed down the only open road. Gerard stared at them, sweat running down his cheek as he tried to understand what he was seeing. Heavy cavalry were loosing arrows without slowing, and he knew no order in the Empire could even dream of doing that. The ground shook as the black-armored horses stormed past close enough for dust and wind to slap against his face. Gerard was unable to hide how deeply their speed and control had shaken him. He quickly counted the backs disappearing ahead of him and felt his stomach drop. There were around 150 of them, and from the pressure of their presence alone, every single one felt like a trained sword user or something even worse. In his mind, Gerard pictured an ordinary knight, one who had only just learned to move mana through a blade. From there, a fighter had to climb step by step, first becoming a proper sword runner before anyone in the Empire even took them seriously. He remembered how only those who wrapped their blades in aura earned the title of sword user, and how the few who truly mastered that power were called sword owners. Above even them stood the sword masters, a tiny handful across the entire continent, and he himself was one of those 15 who were supposed to stand unmatched. Even if every sword owner on the continent were dragged there, they would barely equal the numbers he had just watched race past in a single company. And that thought nearly drove him mad. Far from the dust and screams of the battle, the mountains rose quiet and untouched, their peaks still capped with snow. Gerard trudged through the thick forest, ropes biting into his wrists as he led his horse. Looking up at the steepening slopes around him, he wondered how anyone could possibly live in a place like this, let alone build an entire country there. Then Gerard stopped and tried to warm his bound hands with his breath, frowning as their march suddenly came to a halt. He started to ask why they had stopped, uneasy at the sudden change. But then his eyes locked onto something ahead and his breath caught in his throat. Gerard stared in stunned silence and let out a cry that was half fear and half disbelief. In front of him, a grand fortress of stone and red pillars rose straight out of the mountain wall, shining beneath the sun. In a place he had thought no one could live, someone had built a stronghold fit for a kingdom. Inside the mountain fortress, two guards heaved the thick wooden bars up from the gate. The heavy doors began to loosen, letting in a thin blade of light from outside. A stern officer on horseback led the black-armored riders through the open gate, while the guards pressed the doors wide, and the column rolled past in tight order. From above, the riders flowed out of the stone wall like a dark stream, their hooves beating a steady rhythm. The fortress remained tucked behind its plain outer face, giving no hint of the power riding out from it. Gerard stood bound near the wall, sweat running down his face as shouts echoed around him in a language he could not understand. Then he suddenly noticed that his wrist felt light and panicked, wondering when his captor had slipped the bracelet away without him sensing it at all. He was marched forward with a wooden cage wagon, a lone figure surrounded by endless rows of black armor and leveled spears. Gerard looked at the rows of armored men and felt his throat go dry. He finally understood that every single soldier around him carried power on par with a knight, and that thought crushed whatever hope of escape he still had. He let out a shaky breath and tried to calm the tremor in his chest. Panic would only make him look weaker in front of these people. Near the front, Bureau slammed his fist to his chest and bowed, his voice ringing with respect as he thanked his superior for the effort spent on the march. At the head of the column, Bureau stood stiff beneath the shadow of the armored mount, waiting for orders while the rest of the riders watched in silence. Ko Jinshin looked past the trees and saw tidy fences, patched roofs, and villagers moving with purpose. To him, the place finally felt like a real village instead of a half-ruined camp. Bureau glanced back at the banished elders, their faces lined with exhaustion, and admitted that those stubborn old men had pushed themselves hard to get the work done. Ko Jinshin noticed the bruises and bandages and calmly asked why the elders looked so beaten up. The three men shrank slightly under his gaze, while the Bureau only laughed and said he had merely knocked their discipline into shape, telling Ko Jinshin there was nothing to worry about. With the elders dealt with, the Bureau's eyes shifted to the new guy standing beside the supply wagon. He asked Ko Jinshin about that scruffy brat tagging along at the rear. Ko Jinshin answered without much emotion, saying the boy had made a living robbing graves but handled a sword better than most trained fighters. Bureau listened closely, weighing that rough praise from his commander. Then his eye widened as it truly sank in that Ko Jinshin had actually called the boy skilled. For a man like him, praise from that commander weighed heavier than iron. He forced his face back into its usual calm and stepped past the towering warhorse. Then the Bureau walks toward the bound youth by the wagon and told the grave robber to step closer, demanding his name. Gerard stood there with rope biting into his wrists, muttering that Bureau looked like the same race as some bow-using dwarf, just far too tall. Then he calmly answered that his name was Gerard. Before Gerard could even finish, Bureau yanked him in and drove a heavy blow into his side. Still tied, Gerard could only curl in on himself as Bureau beat him again and again, each strike slamming him into the dirt and leaving his face bruised. Nearby, Yuru watched while Bureau hammered his fist into Gerard and shouted that the grave robber had just told him to go to hell, using that excuse to justify the beating. Yuru watched the kicks land one after another and coldly remarked that Gerard must really be begging for beating himself. Rigel could only wonder how saying Gerard's name had somehow led to this, completely unable to understand why the man was so furious. Then Ko Jinshin suggests that they should hang Gerard up, but Rigel hurriedly blurted out that Gerard was a swordmaster, begging the Ko Jinshin to avoid making this mistake, only to be ignored by Ko Jinshin. Rigel could only stare with wide, shaken eyes and demanded to know what Ko Jinshin intended to do about it. As the sky burned pink above the trees, Rigel strode across the camp toward the wooden platform, clearly determined to interfere himself. But halfway there he stopped short, his face tightening, as he realized the men had already dragged Gerard up onto the platform. Dangling upside down beside another prisoner, Gerard thrashed against the ropes and roared that he was Gerard of the Lightning, swearing they would pay for treating him like this. Ko Jinshin raised his blade toward the hanging man without the slightest hesitation. But Rigel shouted in panic, crying out desperately to his master not to do that. With the cold edge of the sword resting a breath away from his face, Gerard finally fell silent, a bead of sweat sliding down as he realized just how thin the line was between living and dying. Ko Jinshin remained calm while Rigel, behind him, asked in a strained voice why his master was taking things this far. Without turning around, Ko Jinshin answered that if a man wanted to live without regret, He had to deal with any threat immediately before it had the chance to grow into something worse. Rigel's breath came out in pale puffs as he stared ahead, sweat sliding down his cheek, while he thought about how even here the name Gerard of the Lightning still shook the entire continent. Kojinchen did not even bother to face him as he calmly said that he had taken in this famous knight only as a piece to use, not as someone to admire. Rigel froze in the middle of the yard, mouth hanging open, stunned that Kojinchen could speak so coldly about a man like that. Still turned away, Kojinchen added that Gerard had already thrown aside his chance to serve under him. Rigel's eye twitched as fear began to creep in. Hanging there, Gerard let out a weak sound, suddenly realizing this conversation was about his fate and not empty threats. With Gerard hanging like a trophy, Kojinchen told him that he was already a defeated commander, and that only two paths remained to him now, die here or live by joining under his command. Still bound and upside down, Gerard squeezed his eyes shut and turned his head with a sharp, stubborn snort, refusing to bow even with a sword ready to end him. Kojinchen watched him without anger and quietly noted that Gerard's sword skill ranked him on the top 10 in his entire army, and that this alone was why he was offering the man a place instead of finishing him on the spot. Gerard finally snapped, shouting that he was one of only 15 swordmasters on the entire continent, and raging at the idea that Kojinchen had 9 men there who could outclass him. Kojinchen only stared back and told Gerard he was still immature, leaving the proud knight like Gerard glaring up at him in disbelief, stunned that his status meant so little in this place. Kojinchen said that if Gerard came under him, he would turn that rough talent into real skill. Gerard spat back that Kojinchen was treating a full swordmaster like a stone on the roadside, and that if that was the case, he might as well be killed there and then. Kojinchen's gaze hardened, and he slowly drew his sword, the blade humming with power while Gerard dangled only inches away, suddenly aware that the choice might already be slipping out of his hands. Then with one sharp swing, Kojinchen sliced through the rope and sent Gerard crashing to the ground, leaving the knight groaning and cursing while the elder watched, unable to tell whether this was mercy or the start of something even harsher. Then Kojinchen lifted his sword, and a blinding column of light roared up into the sky. The force of it shook the air itself while Rigel stared beside him, barely able to remain standing under the pressure. Gerard and Rigel both stiffened and blurted out that Kojinchen had formed a formless aura blade, something they had only ever heard of in stories. Kojinchen held the blade steady, wrapped in pure, colorless mana, and the onlookers realized that he was shaping non-elemental mana itself, a level of control that made every so-called master they knew look small. Rigel measured the power pouring off Kojinchen's blade, muttered that it completely dwarfed Gerard's earlier strike, pushing close to 5 times that output. Kojinchen watched the light dance along the steel and said that burning this much energy just to make a point was nothing to brag about. To him, such overwhelming strength was only a tool, not something to flaunt. Gerard lurched upright as far as the ropes allowed and roared that even if his skill fell short, he was still a knight. He demanded that even if they would not honor him, they should at least stop trampling on a knight's pride. Kojinchen did not bother to argue. He simply drew his arm back and swept the glowing blade through the air, the arc of light stretching toward the wooden stands. The motion felt less like an attack and more like a lesson he was about to carve into the yard. Kojinchen asked what this title everyone kept shouting about actually meant, as if the word itself carried no weight for him at all. Gerard snapped back their knight was someone who swore loyalty to a lord and carried the duty of shielding those who could not fight for themselves, as though that answer should settle everything. Kojinchen's eyes narrowed, and he asked whether that simple pledge and duty were really all there was to it. To him, Gerard's proud answer sounded painfully small. Gerard's face flushed red as he yelled that calling it nothing was going too far, and he warned Kojinchen to stop dragging knights through the mud. Looking down at the bound knight, Kojinchen said that even a dog at home stayed loyal to its master and bared its teeth at threats to weaker pups. So by that measure, a dog fit Gerard's own definition. Gerard's eyes went wide as the insult landed, stunned that his proud order had just been reduced to the level of a pet. The warlord turned, his heavy cloak snapping through the air as he walked off, finished wasting words on Gerard's pride. Kojinchen strode toward the yard and told Gerard to come along, saying he would show him the kind of knight he kept bragging about. Out on the packed dirt, a trainee took a heavy blow to the ribs and spun, his practice spear flying from his hands. The drill master planted his staff against the trainee's chest and pressed him into the dirt while the other recruits clashed around them, each one being beaten into shape. The instructor leveled his wooden blade at the bruised trainee and barked at him to pick up his weapon and get back on his feet. Gritting his teeth, the young man reached for the fallen staff and dragged himself onto one knee, refusing to stay down. Then the trainee rushed the drill master, lifting his staff high as the rest of the yard exploded into a storm of wild clacking strikes. Across the yard, lines of recruits hammered at one another with wooden blades, every movement sharp and controlled. While Kojinchen watched from behind the barrier with Rigel and Gerard, letting the brutal order of his camp speak for him. Gerard watched the bruised trainee staggering around the yard and scoffed inwardly, thinking that a pathetic mess like this could never be called a knight. Kojinchen did not argue. Instead, he simply pointed across the yard as if to say that the answer was standing right there. But his finger did not stop on armored men. it stopped on laughing village children, and he calmly said that they were knights as well. Gerard's brow tightened, and a bead of sweat slid down as he tried to make sense of it, thinking this talk about children being knights was complete nonsense. On one side, recruits were pushing their bodies to the limit. On the other, children were sharing games and food, and Ko Jinshin stated that everyone inside that fence matched the kind of knight Gerard had boasted about. Thrown off balance, Gerard stepped closer and asked what Ko Jinshin was really trying to say. At that, with all this talk about everyone here being knights, Ko Jinshin's lips curled into a small knowing smile, as if Gerard had finally asked the right question. Across the yard, a whole line of trainees jogged in step with wooden staves in hand, their steady rhythm showing the sharp, hungry spirit Ko Jinshin called a true knight. Ko Jinshin faced the row of tense trainees and let the silence stretch as the sky burned purple above them. Then Ko Jinshin pointed a finger toward the blue-haired trainee and demanded to know why he was standing on that training ground at all. The trainee threw his head back and shouted that he was there to live, his voice cracking with force. Ko Jinshin did not react. He only asked in a low voice what the point of living was. The trainee answered at once that he had to stay alive so that one day he could take the enemy down. Ko Jinshin's gaze did not waver as he pressed him again, asking why the enemy had to be taken down at all. The trainee shouted back that it was so they could win, as if that one word explained everything. Ko Jinshin stepped closer and asked one final time, wanting to know why they had to win in the first place. The blue-haired trainee blurted out that winning meant the unit lived, and if the unit lived, they could keep the country safe. Ko Jinshin studied him and asked what good any of that was, pressing him on why protecting a country even mattered. The trainee stammered that guarding the country meant keeping his family safe, even if it meant he might not survive the war himself. Ko Jinshin pointed out that if he simply gave up, both he and his family could still live. The trainee almost shouted back that this was not the same at all. The warlord narrowed his eyes and simply asked, what makes it different? The trainee yelled that giving up would mean losing his own choice, his free will. Gerard's eyes widening for a moment, clearly not expecting such a fierce answer from a simple trainee. Ko Jinshin turned toward Gerard with a faint, knowing smile while the trainee stood tense behind him, still buzzing from the outburst. Gerard let out a stiff laugh and admitted that the boy's way of thinking was sharp, then added that talk like that was nothing special where he came from, just standard at the Royal Knight Academy. Ko Jinshin answered that this might be true for polished nobles, but his men had been burning fields and plowing dirt just 3 months ago, and now they stood there as fighters. Ko Jinshin fell quiet, a bead of sweat sliding down as he realized those rough men had reached academy-level spirit in a single season without any of the training he had always taken for granted. Facing him head-on, Ko Jinshin said he had no use for someone who was only proud of wearing a knight's shell, and told the man to remember what he was about to say. As the trainees stood in a hard line, Ko Jinshin explained that everyone who lifted a sword did so for the same reason, and that calling yourself a knight did not make that purpose holy, because all of them had first picked up blades to protect people like the children laughing behind them. Ko Jinshin went on, saying they had banded together into units so they could win, and then raised a country so they could protect that shared home side by side. Gerard stared at Ko Jinshin's armor, jaw set, no longer arguing as he took in the idea that his title meant nothing without that shared duty behind it. Ko Jinshin then turned toward Rigel and said he would place the newcomers in their own quarters so they could either rest or walk away if they wished, though his tone made it clear that one final point still remained. Turning his head, Ko Jinshin made it plain that if any of them left now and crossed his path later, they should treat him as an enemy, not an ally. Fast forward, Gerard walked down the quiet path beneath the bright sky, each step heavy as he left Ko Jinshin's camp behind him. As he neared the village, he kept turning that one phrase over in his mind, wondering what it really meant to choose his own path instead of simply following orders. He followed the worn road back into the village, curious and uneasy about the kind of place these rough soldiers were trying to build. Then Rigel slowed as he spotted 2 village children drawing their bows toward a row of targets, treating practice as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The boy kept his bow half-drawn while the girl turned, both of them startled as the stranger's serious voice cut into their play. Kneeling so he was at eye level with them, Gerard asked who had put real bows in their hands, trying to understand how this camp treated its young. The children answered without fear, saying that the soldier uncles had handed out the bows so they could learn to protect the village too. The boy looked at the knight, as if he were the strange one, and said he trained so he could protect his mother, just like the soldiers had taught him. He explained that if they wanted to keep living this free, peaceful life, then even children had to learn how to fight. The knight officer stared hard at the boy, his jaw tight, trying to decide whether this was courage or something twisted. For a man raised on polished words about honor, hearing a child speak like a soldier shook him more than any battle ever had. As Gerard turned away from the training yard, an old man in simple robes walked up and called his name, asking for a moment of his time. The calm way the elder moved made it clear that this talk would be about far more than drills. The old man Gerard knew as Flug smiled softly and asked if they could walk and talk for a while. His voice was gentle, but there was weight behind the request. They strolled along the flower-lined path beneath the bright sky, and Flug remarked that these people treated things like child training and open weapons as normal, even though such acts were forbidden across most of the continent. To him, this place felt like it followed its own laws. Gerard glanced back toward the busy camp, and admitted he could not place their customs anywhere on the map he knew, asking what kind of land could have shaped people like this. Flug's eye narrowed in thought, and he said that for now the only thing he could say for certain was that these warriors were people just like them, with fears and hopes of their own. To him, that simple truth mattered more than any mystery about their homeland. Walking beneath the wide, clear sky, Flug finished by saying that the only real difference lay in how they chose to live. Their blades, their drills, even the training of their children were just parts of a different path, not proof that they were monsters. Rigel lowered his gaze and turned over Flug's words as he began to grasp that these people followed a path nothing like the world he knew. Flug told him that in most lands, people thought it was only natural for nobles to keep all the books and blades to themselves so they could rule everyone else. Gerard pushed back, saying that if ordinary people learned to think and fight, uprisings would become impossible to crush, and the noble class would lose its place. The old man calmly explained that here, people pursued martial strength but trained the mind just as hard. As they walked, Flug said that he had once asked these warriors why they taught letters and martial skill to everyone, even simple common folk, and whether they were not afraid that one day those same people might rise up. In his memory, Flug stood beside Ko Jinshin on a pier beneath a burning sky, and when he raised the risk of riots, Ko Jinshin had only laughed at the word as if it were nothing worth fearing. Flug repeated what he had learned from Ko Jinshin, saying that if a person did not know why they drew a sword or what they had to protect, then even if they won, that victory was empty. The elder finished by saying that in this land, they believed the people themselves had to be wise, so their ruler would stay on the right path and not blunder. Gerard snapped back, calling Flug's belief nonsense, and refusing to accept that a ruler should not fear his own people. Old man Flug remained calm and said he was only sharing how his own lord thought, that anyone who ruled had to accept a heavy burden, an answer for the people beneath him. And when Flug added that dulling the people only ended up ruining the ruler in the end, Gerard Knight fell silent, a bead of sweat sliding down as the weight of those words began to sink in. The sun dipped low over the tiled roofs, painting the sky in soft pink and gold as quiet settled around the house. Inside the yard, a baby girl wailed with all her heart, while the maids rushed around her, trying every trick they knew to calm her down. Then a man in a bright red robe stepped through the gate, and the maids hurriedly bowed with the still crying child, as one of them quietly noted that the young lord had finally come. Cradled in gentle arms, the baby blinked up with wet cheeks, and her crying slowly faded as her eyes locked onto the man in red. The little girl stretched both hands toward Ko Jinshin, and the usually composed man froze for a moment, clearly unaccustomed to being wanted so openly. The baby burst into happy laughter and reached for him again while Ko Jinshin stood there with a stiff face and a bead of sweat, unsure how to deal with such pure affection. The senior official placed a firm but gentle hand on Ko Jinshin's shoulder, wordlessly pushing the younger man to stop hesitating and face the little girl reaching for him. The elder scolded Ko Jinshin for acting so cold, telling him that little Yulji had been searching and longing for him, and that the very least he could do now was give the child a proper hug. Ko Jinshin slowly lifted his hands toward Yulji, and the little girl kicked with joy as the maid leaned forward to place her into his arms. The moment Ko Jinshin lifted her, Yulji burst into bright, bubbling laughter, her tiny arms spreading wide as if she never wanted the moment to end. With Yulji resting against his chest, Ko Jinshin felt her small breaths press into him, and that soft rise and fall suddenly seemed strangely heavy. The elder quietly told him that holding another person's life like this was no light matter at all, but one of the heaviest things a man could ever take on. Still, the elder added that this weight was not meant to crush Ko Jinshin, but to be carried and overcome, and he said it as though he truly believed Ko Jinshin could do exactly that. Facing him like an older brother, the elder told Ko Jinshin not to fear that duty, insisting that he was more than worthy of the place he now stood in. Ko Jinshin turned, and the elder who had just smiled at him was already breaking apart into drifting specks, leaving him standing there with only Yulji in his arms and those heavy words in his chest. The last scraps of the elder's body scattered like dust behind him, and the young lord lowered his eyes, knowing there was no one left to lean on now but himself. Yulji only laughed, reaching up with tiny fingers as if the world were still simple and bright, as if nothing had just been taken from them. The young lord stood there in his heavy red robes with the laughing child in his arms, and for the first time, he held her like a man who truly understood that she was his to protect. After settling Yulji inside, the young lord stepped out of the quiet house, each step down the stone stairs feeling heavier than the last. He paused outside and lifted his gaze to the blazing sky, as though searching the clouds for some answer about what kind of father and ruler he was meant to become. Then his eyes steadied, and the soft light across his face only made his new resolve stand out more clearly. Elsewhere, Buru sat on a stone while a village woman tucked a white flower behind his ear, and Buru into a wide, boyish grin that made him look more like a gentle giant than a warrior of thunder. Back at the house, the young lord glanced toward the courtyard, pulled from his thoughts by the distant sounds of his people living the life he now had to protect. In the warm glow of the clearing, the Yuru hurried over with his arms full of bright fruit, grinning like a child. The elf sat quietly on the rock with her robes spread around her, watching butterflies drift past as if this gentle life was still something she was learning to accept. Yuru held out a single red apple, laughing with his whole face, and the elf met him with a calm, gentle smile. For a moment, it felt as though the war and loss behind them were far away, replaced by something simple and warm. Not far from them, the young lord in red stood at the foot of the stone steps, looking up with a calm, steady face. The light on his shoulders made it clear that he had already accepted the weight that came with this place. His black shoes pressed into the dirt as he finally moved, each step quiet but firm, like he was done standing around and thinking. He walked through the trees beneath a sky painted in pink and gold, his hands tucked behind his back, heading deeper into the forest as if he already knew exactly where he needed to go. Deeper in the woods, the young lord came to a stop in front of Gerard. The air between them felt heavy, as if both men already knew this talk would decide what came next. The young lord's eyes did not waver as he spoke, making it clear that his choice had already been made and there was no turning back. Gerard bowed with his fist pressed to his chest, stating that he would remain there, tying his own path to the young lord's without the slightest trace of doubt. The young lord simply nodded at the vow, his calm voice saying that this answer would do. Gerard lowered his head with a crooked smile, relief mixing with the nervous chill still clinging to his back. After a moment, he looked up and asked whether the promise to let him stay or leave had ever truly been real, or whether walking away would have ended very differently for him. The young lord did not even blink as he admitted that no, Gerard would never have been allowed to simply walk away. Gerard let out a short, shaky laugh, realizing that the man before him had fully intended to remove him if he had chosen to leave. The young lord calmly agreed, as if deciding a man's fate were no different from settling some small duty. Gerard spread his hands in frustration and said that if the choice had always been between serving or being erased, then the lord should have said so instead of dressing it up as freedom. The young lord looked ahead and answered that he had no need for men who clung to life first, and that only those willing to risk everything were worth keeping at his side. Gerard looked up at the young lord and calmly asked where this new master planned to use him. The young lord answered without hesitation, saying he had no intention of wasting a night like Gerard on filthy work such as grave robbing. Hearing that, Gerard's lips curled into a small smile, as if the answer finally matched the master he wanted to follow. Gerard dropped to one knee and declared his full name and standing as a free knight, vowing before the heavens to become a sword that moved only by his lord's will. The young lord accepted Gerard's resolve and calmly added that if he ever strayed and walked the wrong path from that point on, then there had to be a price. With a steady gaze, the lord said that when that day came, Gerard would have to act according to the conviction he had just sworn. He told Gerard that if he ever became unworthy and lost his way, then Gerard must cut him down without hesitation. The two men stood facing one another in the fading light, a quiet understanding between them that their pact now held both their lives. Gerard bent low, sealing the vow with a deep bow, while the young lord in red simply stood there with his hands behind his back, accepting that heavy loyalty without a word. After a brief silence, Gerard turned his back and started walking, leaving the young lord alone in the quiet clearing, with only their long shadows stretched across the ground. His boots struck the dirt in a slow, steady rhythm, each step carrying the weight of the promise he had just made. Gerard's lips curled into the faintest smile, as if this loyal sword was exactly what he would need for what came next. Soon after, he envisioned the black-armored cavalry surge past him like a tide of steel, and he stood in the middle of their charge with his cloak snapping in the wind, already joining their march in spirit. With the roar of hooves all around him, Gerard lifted his eyes toward the armored commander riding ahead, calm and sharp as he weighed the new path he was about to take. He sees himself riding his horse forward, cutting through the field with sure hands on the reins. Bright grin spread across Gerard's face, his eyes shining like a man who had finally found a cause worth staking his life on. Gerard stood alone on the worn ground, watching the black-armored riders charge into the blazing light ahead, already bound to their fate whether he rode with them or not. Ko Jin-chin watched Gerard stride toward the half-built village, his cloak trailing behind him as he already began to fit into the new world they were carving out. Beneath the glowing pink sky, Ko Jin-chin thought back to the dungeon they had found and decided that, for now, it would keep his people fed and paid. Near the cook fire, a young mother called her husband in for dinner while he cradled their sleeping baby, the smell of stew mixing with the smoke. The father turned, his eyes widening a little as he spotted a familiar high-ranking figure stepping into their yard. Ko Jin-chin stood there in his bright red robes with his hands behind his back, while the nervous father bowed slightly with the child held close, hurrying to greet the man they all called Disaja. The father's face softened into a broad smile when Ko Jin-chin praised how lovely the baby was and thanked him, turning a simple visit into a blessing the family would never forget. The young father smiled and admitted that, thanks to Disaja, he now had a family and a happiness he had never imagined he would taste in this harsh world. Ko Jin-chin looked at the man in silence, and the warm light on his face did little to hide how heavily that trust sat on his shoulders. Around them, villagers beamed and called out to him as their great lion, treating the once feared war leader like the guardian of their new home. More voices rose from every side, men and elders alike repeating that name as though calling him their shield against whatever this strange land might throw at them. Ko Jin-chin walked through the small square as the chant circled him, mothers clutching babies and men standing tall, all looking at him as if he were the pillar holding their world together. From above, the village bustled with families who now slept easier, while the man in red moved slightly apart from them, carrying a burden that belonged to all of them yet rested on him alone. Later that night, Ko Jinshin stood at the water's edge beneath a sky with 3 moons, staring up at the foreign stars that now marked the land he planned to turn into his own Goguryeo. Under the cold starlight, he lifted his chin, his gaze steady. Already planning how to turn that strange sky and the land beneath it into a home his people would never have to flee again. He remained at the edge of the pier, the cold wind tugging at his robes as he stared over the dark water, fixing the shape of this new land firmly in his mind. From far above, Ko Jinshin was only a dark speck at the end of a long pier, facing a sky and lake vast enough to swallow him whole, yet he did not look away. By morning, sunlight poured over the grand hall of New Goguryeo, the place where Disaja held court, and where the fate of this land was now being discussed. Inside, a young court official shifted in his seat, thinking that this was not even a war council, and yet a certain man had still been summoned there. The great doors slid open, and Ko Jinshin stepped inside in full black armor, his shadow spilling across the red carpet as the servants bowed low on either side. His armored boot struck the carpet with steady weight, each step announcing that the warlord himself had answered the summons. At the foot of the hall, the elder and the young official bowed to Ko Jinshin, thanking him for coming and assuring him that Disaja would take charge of what followed. The young official studied the black plates and fur mantle, and wondered why Ko Jinshin had come dressed for war when this was not supposed to be a strategy meeting. Ko Jinshin did not sit or relax. Instead, he calmly ordered that Mudiok and Hwigaram be brought to him at once. The elder and the young official exchanged a quick glance, both sensing that Ko Jinshin was treating this as the beginning of a real campaign. His voice then hardened as he ordered that Mudiok, Hwigaram, Rigel, Gerard, and every general of adjutant rank or higher be gathered immediately. The elder stiffened, and the young official's mouth fell open as both men realized that Ko Jinshin had just called in the entire upper command. Out on the training grounds, Gerard and Rigel broke into a full sprint toward the main hall, both of them already feeling the weight behind such an urgent call. Gerard panted out a question about why they had been summoned so suddenly, and Rigel admitted that he had heard nothing either, which only made their unease grow. Moments later, they reached the grand hall of New Goguryeo and raced up the steps toward the doors, where Ko Jinshin and the rest of the generals were waiting to decide their next move. Gerard stepped into the hall and froze, staring at 2 perfect walls of black armor stretching all the way to Ko Jinshin's throne. He muttered that even the Empire's proud councils had never looked this sharp, and that these so-called generals stood more like common soldiers waiting for orders. Ko Jinshin sat behind the long table and swept his gaze over the ranks, before asking whether every officer he had summoned was now present. The leading general stepped forward by half a pace and answered that all adjutants and above had arrived and were standing by for Ko Jinshin's command. With the hall still locked in silence, a servant hurried in carrying a heavy wooden box, slipping past the rigid lines of armor toward Ko Jinshin's platform. The servant climbed the steps carefully and stopped before the table, lifting the box as though it held something that could change the entire meeting. For a moment, the only thing that seemed to matter in that vast hall was the plain wooden box, sitting shut and heavy between Ko Jinshin and his gathered generals. Ko Jinshin lifted the lid, and a harsh red light burst out from inside, washing over his armor and turning the air around him the color of fresh steel pulled from the forge. The red glow rolled over the ranks, and every general stiffened as a heavy force pressed down on them. Even those hardened veterans felt their hearts start pounding faster, knowing Ko Jinshin had just placed something truly fearsome on the table. The object resting before him blazed like a red sun, and its force crashed through the hall. Armor creaked as row after row of generals fought just to remain standing beneath the crushing weight pouring from that single box. Gerard stared ahead with his lips parted as the pressure settled over his chest like a mountain. He could barely breathe, and his mind raced as he tried to understand what kind of power could fill the air so completely. He and Rigel beside him lifted their heads, eyes fixed on the blazing light at the far end. Even Rigel, who had seen more battles than he could count, felt his legs tremble as he muttered that no spell he knew could compare to this. Power burst out through the palace roof in a blinding red flash, wrapping the whole building in a burning shell of light. Even the trees around it bent beneath the shock, as if the forest itself were being forced to kneel. The red beam speared straight into the sky, tearing through the clouds and painting the distant mountains in its glow. Anyone within miles would know that something unnatural had just awakened in the heart of that forest. Inside, the red glare washed over the rows of armor, turning steel and skin the same harsh color. Everyone feels the warlord's power pressing down on them. Ko Jinshin rose from his seat, his cloak falling around him as the red glow curled in his hand. With that single movement, it was clear the test was over. He stepped down from the throne and walked across the steps, his cloak dragging over the red carpet. Below, the ghost cavalry stood in perfect lines, waiting for whatever order would come next. An officer stepped forward and held out a wrapped bundle with both hands. The warlord accepted it without a word, his calm face hiding whatever that weight meant to him. His eyes narrowed as he looked over the sea of helmets, and at last he spoke of their shared fate. The soldiers held their breath, knowing this was no longer just about orders but about all of them. Then Ko Jin-chin laid the truth bare. They had nowhere to return to. It was not a new truth, but hearing it spoken aloud cut deeper than any blade. Far beyond the palace, jagged peaks rose over a thick green forest, a land that owed them nothing. This wild place was all they had now. The warlord's voice remained steady as he said they could not go back, no matter how much they wished it. With that, longing for the old world stopped being an option. A soldier's fingers wrapped around a flagpole, knowing full well about the responsibility everyone here is going to bear. Among the armored ranks, Ko Jin-chin declares once again, if there was no road back, then they would carve a new one here. With that, the standard-bearer slid his hand higher up the pole and locked his grip with the flag itself. With a strong determination, everyone vows to follow their lord's order no matter the cost for the greater sake of Goguryeo. Then hundreds of iron boots crashed down together, shaking the floor as the ghost cavalry moved like a single living wall. Every rider dropped to one knee and bowed his head toward Ko Jin-chin, their answer to his hard truth boiling down to a single vow of loyalty. Rigel stared wide-eyed, feeling every will in the hall being pulled toward a single point. Through that dark banner, the soldiers' thoughts fused into one iron resolve. Ko Jin-chin reaches his hand out, ready to take on the biggest responsibility as a leader. The standard-bearer came down the steps and offered the banner with both hands, and the warlord reached out to claim the mark of their new homeland. His hand closed tight around the cold metal, a simple grip that turned the flag from cloth and wood into a promise. With the banner rising beside his face, Ko Jin-chin looked straight ahead, his eyes calm and hard, already carrying the weight of the empire he meant to build there. Ko Jin-chin's gaze stayed sharp as he raised the banner high, the black cloth snapping above him like a living shadow marked in red. With the pole locked in his grip, the warlord turned toward the hall's entrance, carrying the mark of their new empire on his own shoulder. He strode down the carpet toward the open doors, and the ghost cavalry rose as one and fell in around him. Armor clinked in a steady rhythm, their tight ranks turning his lone march into the first parade of a new nation. Row after row, the black-armored riders moved like gears in one vast machine, every step landing in the same beat. Beneath the dragon crest on their helms, not a single face wavered. They were already marching as if this land belonged to them. Gerard and Rigel watched from the steps as the armored column poured out into the light, the banner's shadow stretching across the floor. Neither of them spoke, but both understood that this was no simple guard unit leaving the hall. This is an empire walking out to claim the entire world. Deep in a quiet forest, a lone elf rested on a sunlit rock while deer, rabbits, and birds pressed close to her as though she were part of the woods themselves. The elf laughed softly as a squirrel nibbled from her finger, while tiny birds settled in her hair and on her shoulder, and the deer breathed warm air against her side. Then the sky split with a roaring column of red light in the distant hills, washing the trees in a harsh glow. The elf and all the beasts gathered around her froze on the rock, their peaceful clearing suddenly facing a power that did not belong to such a gentle place. Bathed in that red light, the elf stared upward with wide eyes, the little creature on her shoulder trembling against her neck. Whatever had just descended into her forest, she knew it was no simple spell, and that her quiet world was about to change. A roaring pillar of fire tore straight through the sky, burning so bright it looked ready to split the world apart. The deer's calm gaze trembled as that power washed over the clearing, its will stolen away in an instant. The elf stared at the red-stained sky, knowing this was neither mana nor any dragon's aura, and a chill ran through her as she sensed how that terrifying force could bend even lowly creatures like these to its will. Far from the forest, a row of blacksmiths hammered glowing iron on their anvils, sparks flying as they shaped steel for the new empire. Then the master smith paused in the middle of a swing, sweat rolling down his face as a heavy, unfamiliar pressure pushed against his chest, stronger than any heat from the furnace. He and the other smiths turned toward the open side of the workshop and stared as a blazing red column rose above the distant hills, painting their entire village in its glow. A sharp order to stop rang through the workshop, and the master smith's jaw tightened as he stared ahead, torn between the iron cooling on the anvil and the growing dread clawing at his spine. Then he set his hammer aside and strode out of the forge, leaving half-shaped blades and anxious workers behind as he headed toward the red light to find out what was happening. The remaining smiths traded uneasy looks, worrying that the iron would cool and warp without their master, and wondering what could shake him badly enough to make him run off like that, until one of them finally muttered that he would go and ask. The master of the forge burst back through the doorway in full armor, that strange red energy curling around him like smoke. The smiths behind him fell silent as they watched him stride in, knowing this was no simple check on the fire anymore. The dwarf smith in an officer's armor planted his feet in the middle of the workshop, one hand tight around his weapon, eyes fixed on the burning sky outside. Whatever was calling to them, he had already decided he would face it first. One of the smiths blurted out a shaky complaint, asking why he had suddenly ordered them to stop working. The dwarf officer gave no answer. He simply heaved a heavy chest onto his back and moved past them. Then the armored officer broke into a run, the chest bouncing against his back as he bolted out of the yard toward the distant red light. The smiths remained frozen in the doorway, watching him charge off without another word. The three of them traded a hard look, each feeling that same pull in his chest, the same force that had driven their master out in the first place. In the end, none of them could bring themselves to just stand there and wait. They sprinted across the yard after him, shouting that they felt that strange pull too. Work, tools, and half-finished blades were all forgotten as they chased the red glow hanging over the land. Above the village, the clear blue sky was being swallowed by a creeping red haze, as if the air itself were burning from the inside. The black banner of Goguryeo snapped in the wind, its red emblem flashing bright against the washed-out sky as though the land itself were bowing to a new power. A full line of black-armored soldiers marched down the village road, every step landing in the same rhythm. At the front, the flag-bearer cut a path through the trees, leading them toward the strange red light hanging over Goguryeo. A young mother stood frozen in her doorway, watching the dark ranks file past her home. The steady clatter of armor made her small house feel even smaller, as if the whole world outside had suddenly begun marching to war. Then an armored guard stepped into the house without asking, his hand resting on his weapon as he faced the woman and her child. His eyes were hard and steady, leaving no doubt that this was not a request but an order. The guard walked ahead without once looking back, and the mother followed, clutching her baby tightly to her chest. Every step away from the doorway felt like she was leaving the safety of her old life behind. From above, the little cottage looked fragile as the marching line rolled past its fence. The mother and the guard stepped out into the open yard, swept up in the same current, dragging the whole village toward the mustering ground. Sunlight spilled over the wooden platform. Ko Jin-chin began to climb, each slow step declaring that whatever this was, it was about to be made official. Ko Jin-chin reached the top and swung the long flag into place, his shadow stretching across the boards. From up there, he would be the first thing every soldier and villager saw when they looked up. He stood tall on the wooden platform, the flag rising into the bright sky above the trees. Ko Jin-chin stood still, the sun catching on his helm as he looked out across the field. In that quiet breath, he weighed the fall of old Goguryeo against the future he was about to hammer into shape. Below the platform, row after row of soldiers waited in perfect lines, not a single man out of step. Ko Jin-chin knew he could carve a new country out of this strange land. Off to the side, a senior officer watched in silence, his jaw set beneath his helm. Even new recruits stood still like stone pillars, waiting to move the moment their lord gave them purpose. Then Ko Jin-chin lifted the black banner as humans, dwarves, and elves watched from behind. This was no longer just a village gathering. It was the birth of a power the whole continent would be forced to notice. Ko Jin-chin's voice crashed over the field as he claimed his birth as a descendant of the great emperor. He was staking his right to rule this land with both his bloodline and his blade. The soldiers dropped to one knee as a single body, shouting their answer to his claim. In that roar, they made it clear they would follow this emperor's blood anywhere, even into another world. From the platform, Ko Jin-chin swore that his rule would lift all humans, not only his own men, and would follow the old principle of serving the greater good. At the same time, he promised to crush anyone who twisted that ideal for greed or cruelty. The front ranks bowed their heads, their voices sharp as they answered his vow. They were not merely following orders anymore. They were tying their own lives to the justice he had just promised. Ko Jin-chin raised the banner high and declared that, as great emperor, he would always ride at the front when it was time to bring enemies down, swearing that his own body would be their shield until his final breath. And the villagers and soldiers alike stared up at him, feeling what that promise truly meant. Ichwigaram stepped forward and swore that even if his body crumbled and only his soul remained, he would still carry out the great emperor's will before heaven, earth, and every human watching. The ranks dropped even lower, and the shout of loyalty slammed across the field. Thousands of throats tied their lives to Ko Jin-chin in a single cry. As the echo faded, an elder general began climbing the wooden steps, each heavy footfall marking a new phase in the oath. The old warrior climbed higher, the long wooden case on his back catching the light, and everyone could see he was bringing something meant to seal this new empire. He crossed the narrow platform until he stood before Ko Jin-chin in the black banner, while the armored ranks below watched in perfect silence. Then the elder general slid the case open with a steady hand, his lined face calm and certain, as if he had waited his whole life to offer what lay inside to this new emperor. The elder general dropped to one knee before Ko Jin-chin and raised the open box with both hands, offering it like a treasure beneath the clear sky. Ko Jin-chin reached into the box without hesitation and wrapped his hand around the carved white hilt hidden inside. He drew the sword free, and light blazed along the blade as he raised it high, letting everyone see the weapon that would stand as the heart of Goguryeo. With the shining blade pointed toward the sky, Ko Jin-chin told them that the empire of Goguryeo would not be a land crushed beneath his rule, but a country guarded by his own hand. The ranks slammed their fists to the ground and roared their answer, swearing that they would follow that kind of empire without a trace of doubt. The great emperor drew in a deep breath and cried out that, for Goguryeo, the very heavens were being opened on this day. With sword and banner raised together, Ko Jin-chin completed the rite, and proclaimed that this opening of the heavens for Goguryeo was now declared to the world. As the order rang out to pay homage to the one who would embrace all things, the high elf dropped to her knees with the rest, staring up at Ko Jin-chin as he stood above them with sword and banner raised like a living pillar. The human chief stared wide-eyed, unable to believe that even the proud high elves who never bowed to anyone were lowering their heads before the new emperor. The high elf sank fully to one knee, her robes pooling around her as she bowed in open homage to Ko Jinshin. The dwarf watched the elf kneel before the platform and wondered what kind of man could make even their proud kin bow like this. As light flared around the platform, the high elf finally understood. In that moment, she saw Ko Jinshin as the one who would gather all races under his rule and shine like a new sun over this world. Later that night, the soldiers sat in loose circles around the fires, laughing hard and waving their cups through the air. Some shouted that their cups were already empty, begging for another round. For the first time in a long while, the camp felt more like a village festival than a war camp. One of the men tipped a clay bottle and filled his comrade's cup to the brim. The clear drink caught the firelight and turned gold as it poured. The bottle passed from hand to hand without a word, rough fingers brushing as it moved along. No one guarded it. They shared it like family. Near the edge of the camp, an officer carefully poured a drink into Ko Jinshin's waiting cup. The emperor watched the stream with calm eyes, the stars and firelight reflecting across his armor. The emperor and his commander raised their cups and drank deep, letting the warmth burn its way down their throats. Behind them, their men were still laughing, but there by the fire, things felt quieter, heavier. The long-haired commander leaned back against the rough log, his cup resting in one hand and a faint smile on his lips. For once, he allowed himself to enjoy the simple feeling of being alive beneath a friendly sky. Then, staring into the flames, he finally asked why Ko Jinshin had turned around on such a huge decision. He wanted to know what had pushed his emperor onto a different path. The fire roared between them, sparks twisting up into the dark while Ko Jinshin sat with the question. For a moment, only the crackle of burning wood answered. Then Ko Jinshin's gaze softened as he remembered the old days and that lonely child in this strange land. Quietly, he admitted that it had felt cruel to raise that child there with no real memory of a mother or father. That statement made the long-haired commander turn toward him in surprise. Out across the yard, the soldiers laughed around their fires. Men who had once fought and bled now working just as hard to build a real life in this new place. Buru and Yuru roared with laughter, bragging about the partners they had found and daring each other to see who could drink the most. Watching them, the emperor thought that these new families and the freedom they had found were reason enough to stand guard over this land, even if he could not dress it up as some noble cause. The commander studied Ko Jinshin's profile in the glow of the flames, sensing that this was not just talk shared over drinks, but a choice his emperor had already made. His mind flashed back to the broken gate and the bodies lying before their burning walls, a memory of wasted power and a kingdom that had failed to use its own strength. Ko Jinshin lifted his head and with calm certainty decided that if this was to be his home, then he would not merely survive here. He would rule this land. HWI stared up into the dark sky, thinking that his emperor was the kind of ruler who valued even the smallest lives and had the strength to protect them. His hand tightened around the bottle and he pulled it closer, ready to trade heavy thoughts for another round of drink. The two warriors raised their cups toward the flames, and the commander called for another pour, admitting that this stubborn promise to protect their new lives was the reason he followed Ko Jinshin without question. The sky stretched wide and full of stars. Out by the wooden tower, Gerard looked up at the black banner snapping against the stars. His eyes locked onto the strange mark at its center. He studied the emblem. The black cloth snapped in the wind, the red three-legged crow seeming almost alive, and the stranger wondered why a simple flag could make his heart pound like this. Then he jolted in surprise as Buru strode up behind him, scoffing at his strange mood and brushing off his racing heart as nonsense. Buru barked at the guy to stop sulking like some spoiled child. Gerard clenched his teeth, stunned that Buru dared speak to him that way. Then he suddenly spotted someone across the yard. Gerard suddenly bolted forward, waving his arm and calling out to Sir Jai Ung-sam for help. He grabbed Jai Ung-sam's vest and begged him to pull Buru away, whining that the mutant dwarf would not stop bothering him. Jai Ung-sam stared at him, taken aback that anyone would dare call Gerard some kind of twisted dwarf. Gerard pointed his finger toward Buru, and grumbled that the extremely short, loud fellow was driving him mad. A few steps away, Buru watched the outburst, his patience beginning to wear thin. Gerard a shaky smile and let out a weak laugh, as if he could somehow turn the insult into a joke. Jai Ung-sam only stared back, sweat running down his face, more annoyed than amused. His eyes went flat, his jaw tightening as he stood there sweating, no longer treating any of this like a harmless joke. Gerard's laugh died in his throat, and his smile froze the moment he realized just how serious Jai Ung-sam had become. With his shoulders hunched, the elf trudged forward while a massive dark presence seemed to hang over him like a storm, as if Buru's wrath were walking right at his back. Buru's eyes burned as he leaned in and followed his order. Jai Ung-sam threw himself forward so hard that his forehead slammed into the dirt, and Gerard, realizing he was in deep trouble, hurried to follow his lead. Buru watched them hit the ground and snapped that Gerard still was not bowing properly, spitting out that this lazy effort suited the lies he had just told. With his arms crossed beneath the night sky, Buru glared down and insulted Jai Ung-sam a liar again, reminding him who is the real boss here. With their faces still pressed into the dirt, Gerard and Jai Ung-sam stayed frozen while Buru finally turned away and walked back toward the campfires, leaving the weight of his anger hanging over their backs. Still pinned to the ground, Gerard cursed his own mouth, mumbled an apology, and wondered how these Goguryeo warriors could be so terrifying and yet so impressive at the same time. Night slowly faded into a soft purple dawn over the mountains, washing the camp's harsher memories in quiet morning light. By the time the others were snoring around the dying fire, Gerard and Jai Eungsam were still trapped in their awkward bow, trading a quiet shaky laugh over how far things had gone. While they still maintained their pose, a bag flew straight toward them and landed next to Gerard. Ko Jin-chin gave out a sharp order to them to get up. Rubbing their aching heads, Gerard and Jai Eungsam slowly straightened, trading a weak look of relief that they had somehow made it through in one piece. Ko Jin-chin told Gerard to grab the bag and come with him. Then he dismissed Jai Eungsam to return to his post. Jai Eungsam forced out a goofy, tearful smile and was happy about the fact that he could finally return. Gerard laughed weakly and apologized, knowing he had just watched his friend suffer because of him. Shortly after that, the sky over the mountains deepened into purple as the world settled down, and their new future slowly took shape. Ko Jinshin's eyes hardened as he declared that from now on, their mission would be to build an empire in this place. Then Gerard hurried over to Ko Jinshin's side, still puzzled, and asked why, with all this power, he had not simply taken over Baron Alvin's city. Ko Jinshin kept his eyes on the dark water and said that his troops could storm a place like that again and again, but trying to hold it now would only bare their throat and cut off any chance to build real strength. Gerard followed after him, stunned, and argued that their army already felt more than strong enough to hold any city they wanted. Ko Jinshin's eyes hardened as he answered that he had risen to build an empire that would last, not some pretty little sandcastle the first wave could wash away. Gerard stared at him in quiet shock, slowly realizing that Ko Jinshin was not merely chasing land, but shaping a future far greater than a single captured city. Ko Jinshin stood over the dark water and said that their strength right now was the only thing that truly mattered. He pictured fresh royal armies pouring out of every city gate and explained that even if they seized a territory, the kingdom could keep sending more troops until his own forces were worn down. Gerard stepped closer, confused, and asked why they had handed out food in that city if the next nobles would simply snatch it away again, leaving the peasants no better off. Ko Jinshin lowered his gaze and let the question hang between them. Gerard stared over the lake with a bead of sweat on his cheek, bracing himself for whatever reason Ko Jinshin had been keeping hidden. Then Ko Jinshin's lips curled into a calm, dangerous smile, as he said he had given that grain fully expecting it to be taken away. As Ko Jinshin laid it out, the elf finally saw it. Peasants whose grain was stolen would begin to hate the kingdom and drift away as wandering farmers, drawn toward the people who had once shared food with them. In his mind, those tired refugees slowly straightened, took up weapons, and transformed into a liberation army marching beneath Ko Jinshin's banner. Gerard hunched his shoulders and muttered that Ko Jinshin was terrifying, stunned that even a simple act of kindness had been turned into a weapon for the future. Ko Jinshin met his worried look with an easy smile and said he had simply helped hungry people, acting as though the thought of raising an army from them had never crossed his mind. Gerard stared out over the dark water, the stars cold above him, trying to decide whether he was standing beside a savior or a monster. His hand brushed the belts at his waist where a plain little pouch hung, though it was anything but ordinary. Ko Jinshin pointed toward it and calmly said he had heard that it could hold an endless amount of things. Gerard, with his head lowered, he could not stop thinking about how someone like Ko Jinshin might react if he ever learned what was truly inside. His blue eyes narrowed, and a bead of sweat slipped down as he wondered whether he could keep that secret from a man who seemed to see through everything. Ko Jinshin smiled in that friendly way of his and said he was only curious, asking the elf to open it and let him take a look. Far away, the Heian kingdom spread out behind its high stone walls, a rich city ringed by dark forests and mountains. Inside the bright marble hall of Heian's palace, a lone knight pounded up the long blue carpet, clearly rushing to deliver news that could shake the entire kingdom. The knight stepped through the towering doors, and they rumbled shut behind him, cutting off the rest of the palace. He moved along the long blue path between silent guards, each step echoing through the bright marble hall. Reaching the foot of the stairs, the knight dropped to one knee and bowed his head in strict respect. Kneeling there at the base of the steps, he formally greeted the king while the ruler lounged on his throne as though half bored with the whole matter. This was King Baran Han of the Heian kingdom, staring down with a dull, tired gaze that made it impossible to tell whether he cared at all or was simply worn out by the burden of ruling. The knight reported that Baron Alvin was dead and that his lands had already been stripped bare. From his high seat, King Baran Han ordered the kneeling knight to gather his light cavalry, ride for the Raganza Mountains, and uncover what had truly happened to Baron Alvin.